They thought they had me figured out. At my sister's wedding, I wasn't the beloved daughter, the shining star, or even a respected guest. No, I was the punchline. The MC introduced me to a room full of polished strangers as the unemployed one. The laughter that followed wasn't kind. It was sharp, cruel, and deliberate. My sister Emily beamed with pride, her perfect white dress shimmering under the chandeliers, while my parents nodded along as if the humiliation was deserved. But here's what none of them knew: 2 nights before that wedding, I had signed a deal that would change everything. A deal worth $500 million. And when that truth broke, when the headlines lit up every phone in the room, the same people who mocked me would be silenced. The forks would clatter. The whispers would turn into gasps. My sister's smile would crack, and my parents' pride would curdle into shame. This isn't just a story about revenge at a wedding. It's about betrayal, buried secrets, and a family that chose the wrong daughter to underestimate. By the end, every smug smile in that ballroom would be wiped clean. Stay with me, because what happened that night didn't just ruin a wedding. It exposed everything my family had been hiding for decades. And I promise you won't see the ending coming. Claire Bennett was 32 years old, a woman whose life had taken her far from the quiet neighborhoods of her childhood. She had built her name in the world of technology, the kind of world where ideas mattered more than appearances, and resilience was often the only currency that paid. To anyone in San Francisco's startup circles, she was respected, brilliant even, but to her family back in upstate New York, she was still the girl who never quite measured up, the forgotten daughter, who never fit their mold of success. The hook of that humiliation still echoed in her mind. At her sister's wedding, she had been introduced to the world as the unemployed one. They laughed, smiled smugly, and for a brief moment, Claire had allowed them to believe their narrative. What they could not imagine was that only 2 nights before, she had signed a deal that placed her in a position none of them could fathom. $500 million. $500 million. The kind of deal that rewrote the definition of failure and success in a single stroke. And as the chandelier lights glittered above them, Claire had held her silence like a weapon waiting for its moment. That silence was the beginning. 2 days earlier, her phone had rung in the late afternoon. She had been sitting at her desk in San Francisco, boxes of documents and signed contracts still scattered around her office. Her mother's voice came through the line, sharp and commanding, without the soft tones most would expect from a parent. "Claire, she said your sister Emily is getting married this weekend. You have to come home. It's not a choice." The words carried the same weight they always had. Not a request, not even an invitation, an order. Emily's marriage, Emily's happiness, Emily's shining reputation. It was all that mattered. And Claire, as always, was expected to play her part in the background. She had stared at the papers on her desk, the ink still fresh from signatures worth more than her parents' entire world could comprehend. There was a sting of irony in the timing. Her family saw her as unemployed, drifting a failure in contrast to Emily's polished perfection. But sitting in front of her was proof of what she had built with her own hands. She wanted to say no. She wanted to tell her mother that after years of being overlooked, belittled, and cast aside, she owed them nothing. But something held her back. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the part of her that wanted them to see the truth with their own eyes. Or maybe it was the quiet voice inside that whispered this might be the moment she had unknowingly prepared for all her life. Claire had packed light, just a single suitcase, as if she knew she wouldn't need much to face the ghosts waiting for her. On the flight east, she leaned back in her seat. Eyes closed, the hum of the engines reminding her of the many nights she had worked alone, believing in a dream no one else would even acknowledge. She remembered the way her parents would shake their heads, whispering to relatives that she was lost, that she still hadn't figured life out. She remembered the holiday dinners where her father's pride in Emily filled every corner of the room, while Claire's accomplishments, however small, were brushed away as distractions. She remembered the sting of being told to her face that she would never be the kind of daughter they could brag about. And still she had persevered. The stewardess offered her a drink, and Claire smiled politely, declining. She needed clarity, not comfort. Outside the window, the horizon was painted with fading light, the kind of sunset that belonged to long journeys and uncertain arrivals. She thought about Emily's wedding, the carefully staged perfection of it all. The photos that would flood social media, the endless compliments about how radiant the bride looked. She could already imagine her mother's voice echoing in the reception hall. "Our Emily, the pride of this family." And then, inevitably, the glance toward her. "And this is Claire. She's still finding her way." The words had always been knives cutting deeper than anyone noticed. But this time, things would be different. Claire carried with her a truth so powerful it could shatter the stories they had told about her for decades. She had signed away her company, a startup that had begun as nothing more than an idea scribbled in the margins of old notebooks, for $500 million. Not inherited wealth, not luck, not a gift from someone else's favor. It was hers. Hard-earned, fought for sleepless nights, relentless failures, and the courage to start again and again until success was undeniable. And yet she knew she would walk into that wedding hall and still be dismissed as the unemployed one. They would laugh, they would smirk, they would treat her silence as weakness. That was fine. Let them laugh. Her mind drifted back to her childhood home, the creaking steps of the old porch, the photographs of Emily that lined the living room walls. Emily as homecoming queen. Emily as valedictorian. Emily as the daughter who could do no wrong. And then the one photo of Claire tucked into the corner, almost as an afterthought. The forgotten one. Even now, the memories made her chest tighten, but not with pain anymore, this time with anticipation. They thought they knew her story. They thought they had already written her ending. But the truth was, they had no idea what was about to come. The plane touched down in New York, the tires hitting the runway with a thud that pulled Claire from her thoughts. She breathed deeply, steadying herself for what lay ahead. She knew the reception would be filled with whispers, with polite pity disguised as smiles. She knew every word would be measured against Emily's brilliance. But this time Claire wasn't the girl they thought they knew. She was something else entirely. As she walked through the terminal, suitcase in hand, Claire whispered under her breath, almost like a vow to herself. "If only they knew what I had signed just 2 nights ago." Claire stepped out of the terminal suitcase, trailing behind her the cool evening air of New York, brushing against her skin. The journey east had carried more than miles. It had carried years of memories she had worked hard to bury. As the cab carried her farther from the airport and closer to the small town where her family still lived, her thoughts began to unravel like a spool of thread, each turn revealing the old wounds she had wrapped tightly away. The closer she came to home, the more vivid the images became, as if the past were waiting to meet her at the door. She remembered how Emily had always been the star. From the first-grade recital where Emily sang a shaky version of Somewhere Over the Rainbow and received a standing ovation from family and neighbors, to the high school graduation where she was named valedictorian, Emily's name had always been spoken with pride. Their parents kept newspaper clippings of Emily's accomplishments pressed carefully into scrapbooks. Her trophies lined the shelves in the living room where guests were welcomed. Every photograph, every framed certificate spoke the same truth. Emily was the daughter who could do no wrong. Claire, by contrast, often found her own achievements either unmentioned or dismissed with a gentle shrug, as if they were merely hobbies, diversions, something to pass the time until she found what her parents considered a real path. The memories did not come in a flood, but in sharp, cutting moments. There had been the evening when Claire had been accepted into a summer program for coding at a local university. She had run home, her heart full, eager to share the news. Her mother had smiled faintly, but only minutes later the door burst open and Emily entered, announcing she had been chosen for homecoming court. The program brochure was set aside, forgotten, while the family erupted in celebration for Emily's crown. It was always like that. Whenever Claire stepped into the light, Emily's shadow seemed to fall across her, blotting it out. Only one person had ever looked at her differently: her grandfather. She remembered sitting on the porch with him one summer afternoon, the air thick with the smell of cut grass and sun-warmed wood. She had been 12, clutching a notebook full of sketches and ideas that made no sense to anyone else. She had hesitated to show him, certain he would laugh the way her parents sometimes did. But he had leaned over his weathered hands, steady as he turned the pages, his eyes narrowing with concentration. When he finally looked up, he smiled in that quiet way of his and said, "You, Claire, are a visionary. Don't ever forget that. You see things before they're real. That's a gift." Those words had imprinted themselves on her heart, a lifeline she would cling to in the years that followed, especially when no one else seemed to see her at all. Her father's words, though, were what haunted her. She could still hear his voice even now, carried across time and space. "Emily makes us proud. You'll figure it out." It was always delivered with that pause, that hesitation before the second half of the sentence, as though he needed to soften the disappointment. It had been said at birthday dinners, after school ceremonies, even once when a neighbor asked about her career prospects. She remembered standing there, cheeks burning, her accomplishments reduced to a waiting game. Those words had been a label, a definition, something she could never seem to shake. The unformed one, the uncertain one, the daughter they could not present with pride. The cab passed familiar roads and Claire's chest tightened. She remembered the feeling of sitting at family gatherings, laughter spilling from every corner while she sat at the edge of the room, her presence unnoticed. She had always been the afterthought, the second plate passed, the second glance, the second daughter. When Emily's name was spoken, it carried warmth and pride. When hers was mentioned, it came with sighs, as though her very existence was a problem that had yet to be solved. To be invisible in your own family was a wound that no success could easily heal. Yet here she was, returning with a secret that could shatter their long-held perceptions in an instant. The cab pulled off the highway, rolling into the smaller roads that wound toward her childhood town. The trees leaned in as if to listen, the air heavy with the scent of pine and damp soil. Claire pressed her forehead to the glass, watching as the landmarks of her past came into view. The diner where Emily had worked one summer and been praised endlessly for her work ethic. The library steps where Claire had once stayed late to finish her projects alone, unnoticed. Each place was stitched with a memory, and each memory carried the same sting. She could feel the weight of it pressing against her chest, the kind of weight that years of distance had never managed to erase. She thought about her grandfather again, the one person who had truly believed in her. He had passed away before her company took root, before she could prove him right, but his words lingered like a quiet promise. "You're a visionary." If only he were here now. She thought he would understand what this meant, what she had built. He would see the strength it had taken to climb from the shadows into the light. Perhaps in some way she carried him with her still. His belief had been the spark. Her journey had been the fire. The car slowed as they approached the town limits. Claire felt her pulse quicken, her breath hitch. For years she had avoided this place, building her life far away, telling herself she didn't need their validation. And yet some part of her still carried the old pain. She still remembered sitting alone in her bedroom as a teenager, listening to the muffled voices downstairs, praising Emily, feeling like a stranger in her own home. She remembered crying quietly, wiping the tears before anyone could see, because weakness would only confirm what they already thought of her. Those nights had shaped her, sharpened her, and eventually fueled the fire that drove her to succeed. But the wound remained tender beneath the scar. As the cab turned onto the street where her parents lived, Claire closed her eyes, her heart caught between dread and anticipation. She was walking back into a place that had never truly welcomed her, a place where every smile concealed judgment and every word of encouragement carried the weight of comparison. Part of her wanted to turn back, to return to San Francisco and the life she had built with her own two hands. But something else, deeper and quieter, held her steady. It was the sense that this moment was not an accident, that her return was not just about Emily's wedding, but about something greater, something that had been waiting for years to surface. She opened her eyes, watching as the familiar porch came into view, the lights glowing warmly against the dusk. A shiver ran through her, not from the cold, but from the memories pressing close. She drew in a breath, steadying herself. She should have stayed in San Francisco, safe in the world she had carved out for herself. But there was something in the air, something unspoken that whispered this night would be different. She thought to herself, I should have stayed in San Francisco. But something tells me tonight will change everything. The cab slowed to a stop in front of the hotel where the rehearsal dinner was already underway. Claire paid the driver and stepped out, suitcase in hand, her stomach tightening as the hum of voices drifted from the banquet hall beyond the doors. The evening air was cool, crisp, with the scent of early spring, but inside she knew the air would be thick with expectation, judgment, and the same hierarchy that had defined her family all her life. She adjusted her coat, lifted her chin, and walked toward the entrance as if every step were an act of defiance. The lobby glowed with golden light, polished marble floors reflecting the chandeliers overhead. Guests in cocktail dresses and tailored suits drifted toward the reception room, laughter spilling into the hall. Claire caught glimpses of familiar faces. Cousins she hadn't seen in years, family friends who had always praised Emily to the skies. A few glanced her way, hesitated, then offered polite smiles that felt more like obligations than warmth. She nodded back, her practiced composure never faltering, though a faint ache tugged at her chest. Inside the banquet hall, round tables were set with linen cloths and glittering glassware. At the front of the room, a head table had been arranged for Emily and her fiancé, their names embossed on place cards in gold script. Claire scanned the room, searching for her own name. It took longer than it should have. Finally, near the far end of the hall, she spotted her card tucked discreetly on a table pressed against the wall beside the swinging doors to the kitchen. The clatter of dishes and the hiss of steam wafted through each time the doors opened. She felt a flush rise to her cheeks, but forced her expression to remain neutral. She slid into her seat, the chair wobbling slightly on uneven carpeting, and smoothed her dress with deliberate calm. Around her, the conversations hummed with easy laughter and raised glasses. No one seemed to notice the deliberate sleight of her placement, or perhaps no one cared. To them, she had always been secondary, a figure on the periphery, someone whose presence was tolerated but never celebrated. It was fitting in a cruel sort of way that she would be seated closest to the kitchen, as though her role was to be unseen, forgotten, convenient to ignore. The first whispers began before the salad plates arrived. Two aunts leaned toward each other, their voices hushed, but not hushed enough. Is she still unemployed? One asked, her eyes flicking in Claire's direction before darting away. The other shook her head with a sympathetic cluck. Poor thing. At her age, too. Emily really is the one who has it all together. The words pricked against Claire's skin like thorns, though her face betrayed nothing. She lifted her glass of water and took a slow sip, letting the coldness soothe her throat. Across the table, a cousin she barely remembered leaned back in his chair, smirking. It's a shame, really. You'd think by now she'd have figured something out. Must be tough watching your younger sister outshine you. A ripple of laughter followed, muffled behind napkins and wine glasses. Claire's hands tightened in her lap, her nails pressing against her palms, but outwardly she remained composed. She let her gaze wander across the room to Emily at the head table. Her sister was radiant, glowing with the attention that seemed to orbit her like planets around a sun. Emily's fiancé leaned close, whispering something that made her laugh, a delicate hand brushing against his sleeve. Cameras flashed, capturing every moment for posterity. Their parents hovered nearby, beaming with pride, their postures straight, their smiles broad. Claire knew they would spend the evening reveling in Emily's spotlight, unconcerned with the shadows where she sat. The waitstaff bustled past her trays, balanced on shoulders, the scent of roasted chicken and garlic drifting from the kitchen. Each time the door swung open, she caught the sharp clang of pots and the hurried orders shouted by cooks. It was a fitting backdrop, she thought, for the role her family had cast her in noise distraction, the background against which Emily's perfection could shine. Her silence, though, was not weakness. She let her eyes linger on the faces of those who whispered, those who smirked, those who judged without knowing a fraction of her truth. Each comment, each pitying glance she absorbed with quiet resolve. They saw unemployment failure, a daughter adrift. What they could not see, what they would not even dare to imagine, was the contract she had signed 2 nights ago. $500 million. The kind of number that turned derision into awe, that could silence even the loudest critic. She did not correct them, did not rise to defend herself. Instead, she let the murmurs swirl around her like smoke, letting their cruelty expose itself without her intervention. There was a strange power in restraint, in holding her silence, while others revealed who they truly were. And so she watched her smile faint, her eyes cool, her heart steady beneath the weight of their judgment. The evening stretched on each toast and anecdote offered in Emily's honor. Claire clapped politely, raised her glass when expected, her expression unreadable. But beneath the surface, she felt the old pain stirring, the familiar ache of being left in the margins. She thought of all the times she had sat like this before, invisible in plain sight. Her worth questioned, her identity diminished. It was a wound that had never fully healed, but tonight she carried something sharper than pain anticipation. When the laughter swelled again at some story of Emily's childhood triumphs, Claire lifted her wine glass, the red liquid catching the light. She felt the stem press cool against her fingers, her grip tightening just enough to ground her. The room blurred around her voices, blending into a distant hum. She inhaled slowly, holding the breath in her chest. And as the kitchen doors swung open once more, the clatter of dishes breaking the rhythm of the evening, she thought to herself. I clenched the stem of my glass, forcing myself to hold the smile in place. I tightened my grip on the glass of wine, restraining the smile. Claire swirled the wine in her glass, her knuckles white from the tension of holding herself still as laughter continued to ripple through the rehearsal dinner. The sting of being tucked away near the kitchen whispered about as though she were some unfortunate case study burned in her chest. Yet she sat straight-backed, letting the warmth of the wine loosen her jaw and steady her expression. She was determined not to flinch under their careless cruelty. As she lifted her eyes from the rim of her glass, her gaze inevitably found its way to the center of the room where Emily reigned like a queen at court. Her younger sister sparkled under the soft glow of the chandeliers, every inch the bride-to-be that guests expected. Emily's hair, perfectly styled in waves, caught the light as though it had been spun from gold. Her gown for the evening was not white, but a pale silk, the shade of champagne, deliberately chosen to hint at bridal radiance, while still marking her apart from what would come the next day. Beside her sat her fiancé, tall, broad-shouldered, his cufflinks gleaming. His smile carried the confidence of wealth, the kind of confidence that came from knowing he could provide, impress, dominate a room with little more than a handshake. Together they were magnetic, the kind of couple magazines loved to photograph, the kind families loved to brag about. Emily basked in the glow as guests crowded near, offering compliments about her dress, her ring the size of the wedding venue. She slipped her hand onto her fiancé's arm, turning her wrist so that the diamond on her finger caught the light flashing like a star. Claire watched as her mother leaned in to whisper to a family friend, her eyes glittering with pride, no doubt repeating for the 100th time how Emily had done so well for herself. Every angle of the evening was designed to highlight Emily's radiance, and it worked. She soaked in the admiration while Claire once again sat in shadow. It was not just that Emily shone, it was that Emily seemed to know how to direct the light so that Claire disappeared. When a relative asked about Claire, Emily's laugh cut through the air like a bell. "Oh, she's still finding her way," she said, glancing over as if bestowing attention were a small act of charity. The cousin nodded politely, his interest already drifting back to Emily's engagement story. It had always been this way. Emily's words had a way of dismissing Claire with the soft cruelty of someone who didn't even need to try. Claire pressed the stem of her glass between her fingers and allowed herself to observe, silent and calculating. Every gesture of Emily's was rehearsed, the tilt of her head when someone complimented her dress, the flutter of her lashes when her fiancé leaned in close, the conspiratorial laugh when her bridesmaids whispered in her ear. Emily didn't just shine, she commanded attention, drawing it from others and hoarding it like treasure. Claire felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the mix of resentment and resignation that had haunted her since childhood. The moment that cut deepest came when Emily approached her table. Claire could feel the shift in the room as heads turned, the bride drifting toward the shadowed corner where she sat. Emily's smile was brilliant, wide enough for everyone to see, but her eyes carried the same sharpness Claire had known all her life. "Claire," she said, her voice pitched just high enough to carry, "I'm so glad you came." Not everyone would have made the effort. Her hand brushed against Claire's shoulder, a gesture of intimacy that felt like a performance for their audience. Claire murmured a polite response, her lips curving into the smallest of smiles, though she could feel the scrutiny of the room pressing down. Emily leaned closer, lowering her voice just enough for only Claire to hear her smile, never faltering. "Not everyone is as lucky as me," she said. "Some people spend years searching and still come up empty. But I guess we can't all have everything. Can we?" Her laughter followed, light and tinkling, the kind of laugh that carried no warmth. It was a dismissal wrapped in silk cruelty disguised as confidence. Claire swallowed hard, her throat tightening, but she did not let her face change. Instead, she nodded as though the words had rolled past her harmlessly. Around them, the guests tittered at Emily's charm, oblivious to the undercurrent. Her fiancé wrapped an arm around her waist, drawing her back toward the center of the room where more admirers waited. Claire sat alone once again, the clatter of the kitchen doors behind her providing a soundtrack to the gnawing ache in her chest. She stared into her glass, her reflection fractured by the dark red wine. The years of being cast into shadow pressed heavily on her, but beneath the weight of humiliation, something else stirred, a flicker of anticipation. The knowledge of a truth none of them yet knew. The laughter swelled once more as Emily's voice carried across the room. She was telling the story of how her fiancé had proposed on a yacht surrounded by roses and champagne, the kind of tale that ensured gasps and admiration. Claire listened without listening, her thoughts drifting to the ink still drying on her own contracts, the kind of deal that dwarfed even Emily's glittering displays. She let Emily's laughter wash over her, the sound sharp and cutting, but she knew it would not last forever. The sound echoed in her ears, bright and triumphant. But as she lifted her glass again, Claire told herself with steady conviction her sister's laughter might fill the room now, but its reign would not be eternal. The laughter of her sister rang out, but it would not last. Claire lifted her glass again, the stem pressing cool against her fingers as Emily's laughter rang through the banquet hall. The sound rolled over her like it had so many times before, a reminder that Emily always managed to command the stage while she herself was relegated to the edges. She drew in a slow breath and turned her attention away, letting her eyes settle on the head table where her parents stood beaming beside their favored daughter. It was almost a portrait, the way they framed Emily with their pride, their posture radiating satisfaction, as though the evening were a culmination of everything they had worked toward. Her mother leaned in to a family friend, her voice carrying farther than she intended. Claire caught the words distinctly, despite the noise of the room. "She's our pride and joy," her mother said, gesturing toward Emily, her eyes shining. "Everything she touches turns out perfectly. We couldn't be prouder." The words were accompanied by a satisfied smile, one that seemed to erase the existence of anyone else. Claire felt the sting in her chest sharp and immediate, though she had grown used to it over the years. There was no mention of her at all, no acknowledgement that she even sat a few tables away. It was as though Emily had become the whole story, and Claire nothing more than a supporting character who barely warranted a line. Moments later, her father joined the conversation, shaking the hand of another guest who had asked about his daughters. Claire did not hear the question, only his familiar response. "Emily makes us proud," he said warmly. Then came the pause, the hesitation Claire knew by heart. "And Claire, well, she's still finding her way." He said it gently as though he were softening a blow, but the words cut deeper than any harsh judgment could. She had heard them 100 times before in different variations, always carrying the same message: Emily was an achievement, Claire was a problem waiting to be solved. The memories stirred by those words rose unbidden. She remembered being 16, standing in the kitchen after winning a small prize for a local science fair. She had held up the ribbon eagerly, hoping for a smile. Her mother had nodded distractedly before turning to remind Emily about her cheerleading practice. Her father had patted Claire's shoulder, saying almost the same thing he had said tonight. "You'll figure it out." She remembered how her stomach had dropped, how the pride she had felt shriveled instantly under the weight of comparison. Even then, Emily had been the one who made them proud, while Claire's achievements faded into obscurity. Now, years later, the words still landed with the same force. She felt the heat creep up her neck, the old ache of being less than enough. Around her, the laughter and chatter of guests went on oblivious to the storm raging in her chest. But this time, she did not allow the ache to show on her face. She sipped her wine, her expression calm, her posture steady, her eyes trained on the tablecloth as if she were simply listening to the flow of conversation. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her hurt. Her mother's voice rang out again, this time louder, as she recounted Emily's successes to a group clustered near the head table. "She has everything now, the fiancé, the career, the future. We always knew she was destined for greatness." Claire let the words wash over her like cold water, stifling the urge to flinch. Her jaw tightened slightly, but she forced her smile to remain. In a way, the predictability of it was almost numbing. This was the role she had always been given, and everyone seemed committed to keeping her in it. Yet under the numbness there was something new, a steady, simmering calm that came not from resignation, but from certainty. She no longer needed their approval. She no longer needed to scramble for a place in their narrative. Because while her parents stood there crowing about Emily's perfection, Claire held a truth so vast and undeniable that it dwarfed every boast in the room. They thought she was still wandering, still lost, still finding her way. They had no idea that her way had already been found, carved out with relentless nights of work and unshakable determination, leading to a deal that would have made even her grandfather's words seem prophetic. The sting of their dismissal still hurt, but it no longer defined her. It was a ghost, a shadow of the girl she had once been, not the woman she had become. She pressed the base of her glass into the tablecloth, grounding herself, her smile sharpening into something faint but deliberate. If they wanted to believe she was unfinished, so be it. Their blindness would make the revelation all the more powerful when it came. As the evening rolled on, Claire's parents continued their performance, basking in Emily's glow, repeating their lines of pride for anyone who would listen. Claire watched quietly, her silence a mask that hid the fire beneath. For years, she had been the daughter overlooked, the afterthought, the disappointment. But not anymore. She had built something that no dismissal could erase, something that would force them to see her whether they wished to or not. She lifted her glass once more, the wine smooth against her tongue, and let the corners of her mouth curve into a smile that no one else could read. Inside, her thoughts were steady, clear, unshakable. They thought she was searching. They thought she was wandering. They thought she had no direction. But she knew the truth, and soon so would they. "I am not finding my way," she told herself silently. "I have already defined it." Claire set her glass down carefully, her fingers lingering on the stem as though the cool crystal could steady her. Her parents' words still echoed in her ears, that tired refrain about Emily being their pride while she was still finding her way. She had let the sting wash over her, wearing her calm like armor. But as she looked across the crowded room, her eyes caught on a figure she hadn't expected to see, someone who belonged to another life, a chapter she thought she had closed long ago. Mark. He was leaning against a table near the edge of the dance floor, his posture casual but unmistakably self-assured, the kind of confidence that came from years of moving in circles, where charm was a currency. Time had changed him. His hair was shorter now, streaked faintly with gray at the temples, and the clean-shaven face she remembered from college had been replaced by the shadow of a neatly kept beard. Yet there was no mistaking him. Mark, who had once been her partner in late-night brainstorming sessions, who had filled notebooks with sketches and ideas beside her, who had whispered promises of futures they could build together. Mark, who had also been the first man she had ever truly loved. Her stomach tightened as their eyes met. For a heartbeat, the years between them vanished. The bustling crowd, the clinking of glasses, the hum of conversation all fell away. She saw him as he had been at 20, ambitious, reckless, endlessly supportive. And then she remembered the sting of his absence, the silence that had followed when Emily took what was not hers, and Mark said nothing. He crossed the room toward her, weaving through guests who barely noticed the weight of the moment unfolding. When he reached her table, his smile faltered slightly, replaced by something softer, almost regretful. "Claire," he said quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I could say the same." She replied, her tone cool but steady. Her heart, however, was anything but. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Mark leaned closer, his breath brushing her ear. "I know the truth about that idea," he whispered. "And I'm sorry for staying quiet all these years." The words pierced through her like an arrow stirring something deep she had tried to bury. She blinked, steadying herself, but inside her thoughts tumbled. He knew. He had always known. The idea that had been stolen the seed of the company Emily had once claimed as her own, before dismissing Claire's efforts as nonsense, Mark had been there from the beginning, and he had chosen silence. Claire's lips parted, though no words came at first. She searched his face, looking for signs of deceit, of manipulation, but what she found was guilt. His eyes carried the weight of it, the kind of heaviness that comes from years of carrying an unspoken truth. Before she could respond, a shadow loomed. Emily's fiancé had approached, curiosity sharpening his expression. He had caught enough of the whispered exchange to sense that something lay beneath the surface. His hand rested lightly on Emily's chair at the head table, but his attention was fixed on Claire and Mark. "What's this about?" he asked, his tone casual but edged with interest. Mark straightened quickly, his smile tightening into something polite. "Just catching up," he said. But the glance he shot at Claire was loaded heavy with meaning. The fiancé's eyes narrowed slightly as he looked between them. "Funny," he said, his voice light but probing. "You don't look like old friends reminiscing about college parties." He tilted his head, studying Claire with fresh interest. "What's your connection exactly?" Claire felt the heat rise in her chest, though she kept her expression even. This was not the time or place to unravel the threads of old betrayals, not in front of the fiancé, who already seemed attuned to shifts in loyalty and power. But his question hung in the air, pressing down with unspoken weight. Mark cleared his throat, deflecting with practiced ease. "We worked on a project together years back. Nothing big. Just ideas." His voice faltered on the last word, and Claire caught the flicker of unease in his eyes. He knew that if Emily's fiancé pursued this line further, everything could unravel sooner than expected. The fiancé gave a thin smile, but Claire could see the spark of suspicion in his gaze. It was the kind of look that belonged to a man who liked control, who didn't trust what he couldn't fully grasp. He studied her for a long moment before finally turning back toward Emily, who was basking in another round of compliments, oblivious to the tension building a few feet away. Claire exhaled slowly, the room snapping back into focus around her. Her pulse quickened, her mind racing. Mark's apology, his admission, had cracked open a door she thought she had sealed long ago. Old wounds bled anew, but with them came something else, a rush of validation, the knowledge that she had not imagined it, that she had not been crazy or paranoid. The betrayal had been real, and now she knew she was not the only one who carried its weight. She looked at Mark again, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The air between them was charged alive with everything unspoken, the regret, the anger, the history. His lips parted as if he wanted to say more, but he stopped himself, his gaze darting toward Emily's fiancé, who still lingered close enough to overhear. Claire's hand tightened around the stem of her glass, her nails pressing faintly against the smooth surface. Mark's words echoed in her ears, unraveling the careful calm she had built. They stirred the ghost of a past she had long tried to forget, a past that had shaped everything but had never been spoken aloud. She had thought it was buried, sealed under years of silence. But now, with one whispered confession, it had risen again. "His words had stirred something I thought was buried," The words Mark had whispered still rang in Claire's ears, rattling the calm exterior she had been determined to maintain. She sipped from her glass, hoping the cool wine would wash away the taste of old memories, but instead it pulled her further back into a time she had tried to forget. It was years ago, in a cramped dorm room littered with textbooks and pizza boxes, when the spark of her idea had first come alive. She remembered sitting cross-legged on the floor, her laptop balanced on her knees, her mind racing faster than her fingers could type. It was nothing more than a concept then, a framework for a platform that could bridge a gap she had seen in the tech world. She had spoken about it with excitement, her words tumbling out in a rush, too fast, too eager. Emily had been there that weekend, sprawled lazily on the bed with her phone in hand, scrolling through social media as though Claire's enthusiasm were just background noise. At first, Emily had laughed. "You really think anyone's going to care about this?" she had said, rolling her eyes. "It sounds like one of your little fantasies, Claire. Cute, but useless. You'll burn yourself out, and in 6 months it'll be forgotten." Claire had flushed, stung by the words, but Mark had leaned forward, then his notebook opened, his pen scratching furiously as he helped her outline the possibilities. He had believed in her enough to encourage her, though he lacked the courage, she later realized, to stand by her when it mattered most. Emily's mockery had left scars that ran deeper than she admitted, because what came next was worse than laughter. Only a few months later, Emily had begun speaking of the concept as though it were hers. She'd mentioned it casually at a dinner table, surrounded by their parents, weaving Claire's own words into her polished, confident delivery. "I had this idea," Emily had said, her tone smooth and assured, as if she had plucked it from the ether herself. Their parents' eyes had lit up with admiration. Her father had leaned back, pride etched across his face, and their mother had clapped her hands together, marveling at their golden daughter's brilliance. Claire had sat frozen, her fork hovering in midair, unable to believe what she was hearing. When she protested quietly at first, then louder, her parents had waved her off. "Claire," her mother had said gently, as though soothing a child, "don't be jealous. Emily is ambitious. You'll find your own thing someday." "You're a dreamer, sweetheart," her father had added, his voice dismissive but wrapped in false kindness. "Not every idea is meant to be real. Let your sister shine." The memory seared through her, even now, years later, with the sting of injustice. She had been branded a dreamer while Emily became the visionary. Their family had embraced the story Emily spun, and in doing so, they had erased Claire's voice entirely. It wasn't only her parents. The rest of the family, too, had chosen sides. At holidays, Claire had overheard the whispers, the quiet chuckles when she spoke of her classes or internships. "Poor Claire," they had said, shaking their heads. "She still thinks she's going to make it big. Such a sweet girl, but so naive." And Emily, radiant and confident, had basked in their praise. She had let them believe the brilliance was hers. She had paraded Claire's dream like a trophy, twisting it, until even Claire questioned whether it had ever been hers to begin with. But in the quiet, in the shadows where no one was watching, Claire had not let it go. She had held the idea close, refining it, reworking it, building piece by piece until the fragile framework became something solid. While her family dismissed her as impractical, she had labored in silence. Nights bled into mornings, failures piled on failures. But she had pressed forward. Every time she remembered Emily's smug smile, every time she replayed her father's voice, saying she would find her way someday, Claire poured the anger into her work. Years passed. Investors turned her away, at first skeptical of her youth and her gender. She faced rejection after rejection, learned to mask her fury with professionalism, learned to turn closed doors into fuel. Slowly she found her footing, securing allies who saw what Emily and her family never had. Her company grew brick by brick, code by code, until it became undeniable. And then, only weeks ago, the deal that changed everything had landed on her desk. $500 million. A validation not just of her idea, but of her resilience, her refusal to be erased. Now, as she sat in the opulent banquet hall of her sister's wedding, watching Emily bask in the glow of admiration, the memories pressed down heavier than the chandeliers above. She thought of the girl she had once been silenced and belittled, told she was nothing but a dreamer, and she thought of the woman she had become with a company that bore the weight of her name and vision. Emily still didn't know. She still lived in the comfort of her own lie, convinced Claire's idea had been a passing whim too fragile to last. She still believed her theft had buried her sister's ambition, but she was wrong. Emily had no idea that the foolish dream she mocked had become a reality worth $500 million. And she had no idea that tonight in this very hall, her lies would begin to unravel. She had no idea that the silly little dream she had laughed at now carried a value she could never touch. She had no idea that dream was worth $500 million. The echoes of her family's words still lingered in Claire's chest as the evening marched on each smile and toast, a subtle reminder of where she stood, or rather where they thought she stood. She had endured their whispers, their dismissive glances, the constant comparison to Emily. Yet nothing quite prepared her for what came next. The MC, a man with a booming voice and a too-bright smile, had been hired to add flair to the reception. He had already introduced Emily and her fiancé with theatrical flourish, praising their perfect union as though reading from a fairy tale script. The crowd cheered, glasses clinked, and the music swelled with celebratory notes. Then, as though the evening needed another moment of light-hearted humor, he turned his gaze toward Claire. And of course, he announced, raising his microphone high, "Let's not forget the bride's beloved sister Claire." Heads turned toward her, and she straightened instinctively, the weight of eyes pressing against her. The MC grinned wider, pausing for effect, before delivering the line that would cut through her like a blade. "Claire, the unemployed one." The room erupted in laughter. It wasn't polite, nervous laughter. It was genuine bubbling. Some even doubled over at the joke as if it were the most entertaining moment of the evening. Forks clattered against plates as people covered their mouths, chuckles spilling out between murmurs of pity. Claire caught the raised brows, the smirks, the pitying shakes of heads. She could almost hear the thoughts unspoken, "Poor girl still hasn't figured it out." Always in Emily's shadow. And then there was Emily. From her place at the center table, draped in lace and jewels, Emily leaned back in her chair, her laughter sharp and triumphant. It was the laugh of someone who knew she had won, who relished the spectacle of her sister being reduced to a punchline. Her lips curled, her eyes gleamed, and she basked in the humiliation as though it were her coronation gift. Claire sat very still. Her hand tightened around the stem of her wine glass, until her knuckles whitened, but her face betrayed nothing. She let the laughter wash over her, let it stab and sting, and then slowly she lowered her eyes to the glass in her hand. The deep red liquid caught the chandelier's glow, swirling like a pool of secrets. She breathed in deeply, the calm she had cultivated over years of silence rising within her. They didn't know. They couldn't know. To them, she was still the dreamer who never succeeded, the sister who never measured up. They thought the joke was harmless, a bit of fun at her expense, not realizing how their laughter echoed every cruel dismissal from her past. Inside, however, her pulse raced not with shame, but with restraint. It took everything in her not to let the truth spill out, not to slam her glass down and announce exactly who she was, what she had built, and how she had left them all behind in the dust of her determination. But not yet. The time would come. She looked up again, her eyes locking briefly with Emily's. Her sister smirked, tilting her head as if daring Claire to protest, to lash out, to ruin the polished illusion of the evening. Claire simply smiled, calm, composed, maddeningly unreadable. That smile unsettled Emily just enough to make her shift in her seat, though she quickly disguised it with another laugh. Around the room, whispers continued to ripple. A woman leaned toward her husband, murmuring, "I heard she dropped everything years ago. Never got it together." Another voice chimed in from a nearby table. "Well, not everyone can be Emily." Claire heard them all let them etch themselves into her memory like tally marks in a ledger. She had kept receipts for years, and tonight she added more. The MC, oblivious to the damage he had inflicted, moved on with his script, introducing the bridal party with forced cheer, his booming voice drowning momentarily in the chatter that lingered in the aftermath of the joke. The laughter faded into a hum, but its echo remained sharp, cutting into Claire's composure like glass underfoot. She swirled the wine in her glass, letting the motion soothe her, her lips pressing into a faint curve that no one could quite decipher. To anyone watching, she appeared unbothered, perhaps even amused, but beneath the surface, her thoughts churned. If only they knew what had happened 2 nights ago. If only they had seen the ink dry on that contract, the handshake that sealed the future she had carved from their doubt. She remained still, holding her glass as though it anchored her to the moment, to the patience she had promised herself. Because timing mattered. And this wasn't the moment to reveal her truth. This was the moment to endure, to let them dig deeper into their illusion, so that when the truth finally emerged, it would crush them with its weight. As the MC carried on, the music swelled again, pulling the focus back to Emily and her groom. The laughter had already been forgotten by most of the guests, a fleeting piece of amusement on a night filled with wine and spectacle. But for Claire, it would not be forgotten. It was another scar, another wound added to the collection. Her gaze drifted across the room past the glittering lights and smiling faces to Emily again. Her sister's head was thrown back in laughter, her hand clasping her fiancé's as though nothing in the world could disturb her reign. Claire's jaw tightened, her grip on the glass firm but steady. She had endured their ridicule before. Tonight was no different. But soon, very soon, the balance would tip. And then it happened. The shrill sound of a phone cut through the music and chatter, slicing into the evening like a blade. The ringtone echoed across the hall, sharp and insistent, demanding attention. Guests turned their heads, puzzled, their laughter dying on their lips, as the sound grew louder, more intrusive. Claire raised her eyes from her glass, her heart quickening. But then a thought flashed through her mind like lightning. This was no ordinary interruption. This was the moment the night would begin to change. But then a phone rang, and everything shifted. The shrill ringtone that sliced through the wedding hall had barely faded when another sound replaced it, the crackle of speakers and the sudden hum of the projector mounted against the far wall. Guests glanced toward the screen, puzzled, as the slideshow of Emily and her fiancé's childhood photos flickered away, replaced by a live feed. At first, it looked like a glitch, the kind of technical hiccup that might occur at any event. But within seconds, the image sharpened. The face staring back at them from the enormous screen was Claire's. It was a video clip recorded only days earlier in San Francisco. Claire recognized the setting instantly, the glass-walled office of a venture capital firm, the skyline of the Bay Area behind her. She remembered the interview clearly, though she hadn't expected it to be made public yet. She had agreed to it only because the non-disclosure agreement surrounding her deal had expired the night before. She had spoken candidly about her journey, about the long nights, the failures, the risks, and the eventual triumph that came when a major corporation signed on to acquire her startup. And so when we closed at $500 million, her voice rang out over the speakers, calm and assured. It wasn't just a business milestone. It was proof that persistence matters more than anyone's doubt. It was proof that you can start with nothing but an idea and make it real. The hall went silent. Forks froze halfway to mouths, glasses hovered mid-air. One could almost hear the collective intake of breath, the sound of disbelief colliding with admiration. The camera panned slightly in the video, showing Claire shaking hands with an executive whose name alone carried weight in the tech world. Subtitles at the bottom of the screen confirmed it a $500 million acquisition. Claire sat motionless at her table, her glass still in hand, but her heart thudded against her ribs. This wasn't how she had intended for them to learn. She had planned to say nothing, to let her family stew in their assumptions until the timing suited her. But the video was undeniable, and now the truth blazed across the wall for every guest to see. All around her, whispers erupted like wildfire. Did she just say 500 million? One voice gasped. Her company, another echoed. No, that can't be right. Claire Emily's laughter died mid-breath. Her smile faltered as she whipped her head toward the screen. Turn that off, she snapped, her voice sharper than anyone had ever heard from the polished bride. She waved frantically at the MC, at the technician in the corner, at anyone who might be responsible. This isn't supposed to play. But the technician only shook his head, flustered. I don't know how it got cued, he stammered. It must have been loaded by mistake. Claire noticed with no small measure of irony that Emily herself had orchestrated the evening's displays. She had bragged about hiring a local journalist to capture exclusive moments of the day, insisting it would elevate her wedding to something newsworthy. It seemed the files had gotten crossed, or perhaps fate had decided the truth would no longer be hidden. On the screen, Claire's recorded self continued unflinching. People told me it was impossible the video version of her said her voice steady and warm. But I learned the only impossible thing is silencing someone who refuses to stop trying. A ripple went through the crowd. The guests who had laughed at the MC's cruel joke only minutes before now stared with wide eyes, their amusement replaced by something heavier. Shame, awe, and a dawning realization that they had underestimated the wrong sister. Emily's hand slammed down on the table, rattling silverware. She rushed toward the technician, her gown tangling at her feet as she hissed, "Shut it down now!" The man fumbled with his laptop, panic etched across his face, but the video played on unstoppable, filling every corner of the grand hall with Claire's story. Claire sat in silence, watching the chaos unfold. Emily clawed at the laptop, her desperation visible to all but her efforts, only deepened the humiliation. Each second the video rolled was another nail in the coffin of her carefully curated narrative, and then the applause began. Hesitant at first, a smattering of claps from one corner of the room, then another. Within moments it grew into a swell, the sound of recognition, of respect, of a room shifting its loyalty. Guests rose from their seats, craning for a better view of the woman they had dismissed as unemployed. Claire didn't rise. She didn't wave or bow. She simply sat, her fingers resting lightly on her glass, her expression serene. Inside, however, a storm of emotions surged: relief, vindication, and the kind of satisfaction that comes when truth finally forces its way into the open. Emily spun back toward the crowd, her face red with fury. "It's a mistake!" she shouted over the noise. "This isn't. She's not." But no one listened. The evidence was too clear, too undeniable. Every eye turned toward Claire. Every whispered doubt dissolved into silence. And in that silence, the power shifted. The joke of the unemployed sister was gone, replaced by the truth of a visionary who had triumphed despite them all. Claire lifted her chin, meeting Emily's gaze across the room. Her sister's face had drained of color, the confidence stripped away, leaving only raw panic. Emily's face went pale, and at last Claire allowed herself to smile. The applause that had swelled in the hall faded into a chorus of murmurs, but the shift in atmosphere was irreversible. The video had ended, the screen now blank, yet its echoes lingered as though the words were still hanging in the air. Claire felt the weight of hundreds of eyes on her, heavy and unrelenting, no longer filled with dismissal or pity, but with a new, raw curiosity. For years, she had been the invisible one. The sister people glanced past the relative they spoke of with soft pity. Now, suddenly, she was the center of gravity in the room. Guests abandoned their plates, the untouched entrees cooling on the tables as chairs scraped across the polished floor. One after another, people approached, some tentatively, others with an eagerness that bordered on intrusive. A woman in a sequined dress leaned forward, her voice hushed but urgent. "Claire, is it true? $500 million? How did you do it?" Before Claire could answer, another voice broke in. "I read about acquisitions like this in the Wall Street Journal. My nephew works in finance. He'll be floored when I tell him I met you." A man reached for her hand, shaking it vigorously as though she were a dignitary instead of a forgotten guest at her sister's wedding. The questions came in a flood. What was her company called? How had she started? Who were the buyers? What would she do with the money? Claire heard them all but answered only sparingly, her tone calm, her smile polite. She offered no grand speeches, no gloating declarations. Her words were measured, gracious, even warm, though she felt the storm brewing around her. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Emily. The bride had risen halfway from her chair, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the table. The spotlight that had bathed her all evening now flickered, shifting toward the sister she had dismissed. Her face betrayed the collapse of a world carefully built on appearances. She tried to smile, tried to nod along as though the celebration still belonged to her, but the effort was brittle. Each new guest who clustered around Claire pushed Emily further into the shadows of her own wedding. Claire watched her stagger slightly, her gown tangling around her as she moved toward the group, her laughter too loud, too forced. "It's just a misunderstanding," Emily chirped, her tone trembling beneath the surface. Claire's always been dramatic with her ideas, but her words fell flat, smothered by the undeniable evidence the guests had just seen with their own eyes. One man chuckled nervously, clearly unsure where his allegiance should lie. "Misunderstanding Emily. We just saw her with the executives shaking hands on the deal. That's not drama, that's real." Emily faltered, her lips parting but no words emerging. She sat back down heavily, her eyes darting around the room, desperate for anyone, to validate her version of reality. None did. The tide had turned. Claire's calm demeanor only sharpened the contrast. She did not rush to correct Emily, nor did she rise to bask in the moment. She sat with quiet authority, answering the questions directed at her with the ease of someone who had nothing to prove. The more gracious she was, the more Emily's bitterness showed. A child no older than 10 tugged at his mother's sleeve and whispered not as quietly as he thought, "Why didn't they know? How could they not know she did something so big?" His mother hushed him, embarrassed, but the truth of the boy's question hung in the air like smoke. Claire smiled faintly. She knew the answer but kept it to herself. They had not known because they had never cared to ask. Her silence had made their dismissal easier, and their dismissal had made her success sweeter. Emily's fiancé, seated stiffly beside her, leaned back in his chair, studying Claire with new interest. His expression was unreadable, though the flicker of calculation in his eyes did not escape Claire's notice. For a brief moment their gazes met, and she wondered how long it would take before he began to measure Emily against the sister he had been told was nothing. The questions from the crowd grew bolder. "What's next for you?" a man in a dark suit asked. "Will you stay in San Francisco, or come back here and invest?" Another chimed in. "Do you need advisors? I have contacts in Albany." Each voice layered over the last until the hall buzzed with restless energy, no longer about the bride or the groom, but about Claire. Emily shifted again. Her smile stretched thin, her complexion paling beneath the makeup she had carefully chosen to radiate perfection. For the first time in her life, she was the backdrop, and Claire was the painting. Claire tilted her glass, watching the wine catch the light. The irony was not lost on her. For years she had been ignored, dismissed, humiliated. And now, in the very moment her sister had hoped to cement her dominance, the truth had broken free, unstoppable. She had not asked for this display, yet it had arrived like a storm, sweeping away the carefully laid illusions of her family. The storm was only beginning. She felt it in the whispers, in the shifting alliances, in the weight of stares that now lingered on her rather than Emily. The balance of power in this family, in this room, had tilted. Claire allowed herself a single measured breath, her smile steady. And that was only the beginning. The chatter around Claire had begun to die down, not because the curiosity of the guests was satisfied, but because the revelation had settled over the room like a heavy blanket, suffocating the old narratives and replacing them with something unshakable. Claire had answered their questions with the kind of grace no one had expected, and now they retreated to their seats, whispering to one another, stealing glances at her as though she were a living headline. The music had faltered into an awkward pause, the MC unsure how to wrestle back control of the evening. Claire sat tall, her expression calm, her glass poised elegantly in her hand, while across the table Emily sat pale and diminished. Through it all, one pair of eyes lingered on her more intently than the rest. Her father had remained quiet, a still figure in the storm, his jaw tight, his knuckles pressed white against the linen tablecloth. He had not joined in the laughter earlier, nor in the applause that followed the video. He had simply watched, his silence carrying a weight that made Claire more aware of him than anyone else in the room. Finally, as the guests returned to their meals with only half-hearted bites, he leaned closer, his voice low but cutting through the hum of conversation. "Why didn't you say anything, Claire?" His eyes bore into hers, searching for an answer that would let him reconcile the daughter he thought he knew with the woman who now commanded the room. "All this time, why keep it from us?" Claire turned her head, meeting his gaze directly. She didn't flinch under the force of it. Her voice, when it came, was soft but steady, every syllable wrapped in truth she had carried for years. "Because she said you and Mom never wanted to hear it. You never asked, and when I tried, you didn't listen." The words landed between them like a stone tossed into still water rippling outward. She didn't raise her voice, didn't accuse, didn't spit the bitterness she might have felt, but her calm made the statement sharper than anger could have. Her father blinked, his mouth parting slightly, yet no sound came. His face, which had so often worn an air of authority and judgment, now cracked with something unfamiliar doubt. Memories pressed in on her, uninvited but vivid. Nights at the dinner table where Emily's grades, Emily's achievements, Emily's charm filled the conversation while Claire's attempts to speak of her projects were brushed aside. Her father had often leaned back in his chair with that same expression, pride glowing, as he looked at Emily in weariness when his eyes fell on Claire. "You'll figure it out," he had said more than once, a line meant to comfort but weighted with dismissal. Now sitting in the grandeur of Emily's wedding, surrounded by the ruin of illusions, those old moments returned to him too. She saw it in the way his brow furrowed, in the way his hands shifted uneasily on the tablecloth. He remembered, just as she did, how he had chosen to believe Emily's polish over Claire's quiet determination, how he had let himself be charmed by the daughter who shone brightest in the spotlight while ignoring the one building something in the shadows. "Claire," he said again, but the force was gone from his voice, replaced with hesitation. He looked at her as though trying to see her clearly for the first time, not the failure he had assumed her to be, but the woman who had just proven him wrong in front of everyone. Claire held his gaze unyielding. She didn't need to fill the silence that followed. For once, the silence belonged to him. She let him sit in it, let him wrestle with the weight of his choices, the consequences of years of neglect. Around them, the celebrations stuttered awkwardly on. Waiters refilled glasses, music tried to reassert its place, and guests whispered about investments and possibilities. But in the space between father and daughter, the air was thick and unmoving, a private reckoning cloaked in public view. Her father's lips pressed together, then parted, then closed again. He seemed to struggle with words, with apologies that would not come with defenses that suddenly felt hollow. In all her life, Claire could not remember a time when her father had been speechless. Yet here he was, undone, not by argument, not by rebellion, but by a truth so simple it could not be ignored. He had never listened. Claire leaned back slightly, her calm never wavering, and sipped her wine. The gesture was deliberate, controlled, a quiet reminder that she was no longer the child waiting for his approval. She was a woman who had carved her own place in the world without it. His silence stretched on, more deafening than any outburst could have been. For the first time he was forced to see her, and for the first time he could not speak. And in that silence Claire found her own kind of victory. Her father's silence said more than his words ever had. The silence between Claire and her father had carried a weight that shifted something in the air. She could feel the cracks widening in the foundation of the evening, the power that once flowed so easily toward Emily, faltering with each passing moment. Guests who once ignored her now watched her closely, their curiosity no longer tempered by pity, but sharpened by admiration. And then came the voice that sliced through the murmurs, clear and deliberate. "So Claire, Emily's fiancé," said, rising slightly from his chair to lean across the table. His smile was polished, the kind of smile one learns after years of networking and business dinners, but beneath it flickered genuine intrigue. "Tell me more about this company of yours. How did you build something big enough to catch the eye of an acquisition like that?" The question hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. For a man who had spent months preparing for this day, carefully aligning himself with Emily's image of success, it was striking that his focus now veered so openly toward Claire. his eyes fixed on her with a keen intensity, and though he tried to cloak it in casual interest, everyone at the table could feel the shift. Claire paused only a moment before answering. She didn't rush, didn't flaunt. "It started small," she said evenly. "An idea I couldn't let go of. I worked on it through the nights, through the failures. It grew because I refused to let it die even when others told me it wasn't worth pursuing." Her words were measured, but her gaze held steady on his meeting curiosity with quiet strength. Emily's hand shot across the table, lightly brushing his sleeve. "Darling, you don't want to get bogged down in business details tonight," she said with a strained laugh. "This is our wedding. Let's keep the focus where it belongs." Her tone was sweet, but her eyes betrayed a flash of panic. He didn't look at her. On the contrary, he replied smoothly, still watching Claire. "I think it's fascinating. A $500 million deal isn't exactly a footnote. That kind of success doesn't just happen. You must have seen something others missed." The murmur of guests nearby swelled again. They weren't trying to be discreet anymore. A woman whispered loudly to her companion, "Look at him, he can't take his eyes off her." Another voice tinged with amusement followed. "Seems like he's more impressed with Claire than with his bride." Emily's smile tightened, the corners of her mouth stiff as porcelain. She reached for her champagne, drinking more quickly than she intended, and set the glass down with a sharp clink. "She's exaggerating," Emily said, her voice pitched higher now. "Claire has always loved spinning things into bigger stories than they are. It's a hobby of hers." But the words landed flat hollow against the undeniable evidence of the video still echoing in their minds. The fiancé chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I don't think it's exaggeration. I saw the handshake in that clip, the executives. That wasn't a hobby, Emily. That was history in the making." Claire said nothing. She didn't need to. Every second her future brother-in-law ignored Emily's attempts to redirect the conversation was another chisel strike at her sister's carefully constructed image. Emily tried again, leaning forward, her laughter louder, too brittle. "You really want to spend your wedding night talking about startups and deals? Come on, there are more important things." He glanced at her, then briefly, almost impatiently, before returning his focus to Claire. "Actually," he said smoothly, "this is important. Success like that doesn't come around often. Tell me, Claire, what's the next step? Do you stay with the company or move on to something new?" Claire took her time before answering, swirling the last of her wine in the glass. She could feel Emily's fury vibrating across the table, her fingers tapping against the linen, her posture rigid. Finally, Claire answered with a smile that carried both humility and strength. "I haven't decided yet. But whatever I choose, it will be on my terms." The guests nearby nodded approvingly, their whispers now turning into open admiration. Someone clapped softly, a gesture of respect that quickly spread to murmurs of agreement. Emily's fiancé leaned back, his smile thoughtful, his interest not dimmed but sharpened. Emily sat frozen, her hands trembling slightly against her lap, her jaw clenched so tightly Claire thought she might crack a tooth. For years she had been the star, the one people orbited around, and now in the most important night of her life she was the afterthought, her light dimmed by the presence of the sister she had dismissed as nothing. Claire let her gaze sweep the room, catching the subtle nods, the way conversations turned toward her instead of Emily, the admiration that once seemed impossible. She didn't gloat, didn't bask. She simply sat with quiet composure, knowing full well that silence often spoke louder than triumph. For the first time in her life, Emily was not the star of her own story. The shift in attention that had begun at the table did not stay confined within the walls of the ballroom. What had started as whispers and side glances had already begun to ripple outward, and by the time dessert was being cleared, the tide had grown into something Claire could feel pressing in from every direction. Guests had their phones out, not to photograph the bride's dress or the towering cake, but to capture her. Claire caught the flicker of flashes at the edge of her vision, the discreet swipes of fingers scrolling to news feeds that had begun exploding with her name. Screens glowed at nearly every table. On Twitter, hashtags were forming in real time. Headlines were plastered across financial sites and lifestyle blogs alike reporting the staggering deal that had just closed. By the time the first champagne flute was raised for another toast to the bride and groom, Claire's photo was already trending. Some posts were reverent. A hometown girl just sold her company for $500 million. Incredible. Others were smug, written by the very guests sitting in the room at Emily's wedding, but the real star is her sister. What a twist. Emily noticed, of course. Her laugh grew louder, more forced. Her gestures exaggerated as she tried to pull focus back to herself. But the spotlight had shifted, and no amount of volume could drown the pull of a story bigger than a dress or a dance. The humiliation etched itself in every line of her stiffening smile as she realized she was no longer the main character of her own event. By the time the band struck up another song, the doors of the ballroom were crowded with photographers who hadn't been invited but had smelled a story. Their voices carried faintly over the music, "Claire, Claire, over here." Just one picture and the restless shuffling of their lenses followed. Guests pressed toward the windows to see, craning for a glimpse of the chaos brewing outside. Some slipped out to snap their own photos with Claire before the press could eager to be first to boast that they had been there when history broke. Claire moved carefully through it all, offering smiles and polite nods but saying little. She had no interest in giving a soundbite, not tonight. The restraint made her all the more magnetic. People leaned in to catch her every word, mistaking her quiet composure for mystery. Each refusal to elaborate, each gentle shrug seemed to feed the frenzy rather than quiet it. Emily's fiancé tried to restore order, clinking his glass and urging the crowd back to the dance floor, but the damage was done. Attention had shifted irrevocably. Where once Emily had been the sun-commanding orbit, now Claire was the undeniable center. The comparison was brutal. While Emily's glow seemed to flicker like a candle threatened by wind, Claire's presence burned steady, untouchable. Claire watched with a detachment that was almost clinical. She had spent years perfecting this calm, learning to let storms rage around her without being pulled under. But beneath it, a pulse of vindication thudded in her chest. She had not come here seeking revenge, but it had arrived anyway, wrapped in flashing cameras and astonished whispers. As the night drew on, the ballroom itself seemed to fracture. Half of the guests pressed in on Claire, eager to bask in her aura, while the other half circled Emily in a futile attempt to console her. The divide was stark, and for the first time Emily could not bridge it. Claire saw her sister's desperate glances dart across the room, searching for allies, for a way to pull the narrative back into her grasp. But it was gone, ripped from her hands by headlines she could not control and voices she could not silence. Outside, the crowd of reporters grew thicker, their shouts rising above the music, a reminder that the story had left the confines of family drama and entered the realm of spectacle. Inside, guests whispered, took more pictures, and posted updates in real time. It was as if the wedding itself had been swallowed whole by the weight of Claire's success. Claire's glass remained steady in her hand as she surveyed the chaos. She did not need to raise her voice or step onto the stage. Her silence spoke louder than Emily's laughter, louder than the reporters outside, louder than every whispered word in the room. And as her eyes met Emily's across the crowded dance floor, she understood with startling clarity what was coming next. Her sister would not accept this. Emily would claw, twist, and scheme until she found a way to drag the light back to herself. She would not surrender her crown without a fight, even if it meant burning everything down around her. She would do anything to reclaim the spotlight. Anything. The ballroom still pulsed with the aftershocks of attention, the low hum of conversations that circled Claire like a restless tide. Cameras flashed outside, chatter swirled inside, and Emily's laughter rang hollow against it all. Claire had learned to steady herself in moments like these, to hold her ground, as though the storm was something she could weather by simply refusing to be moved. But she had not anticipated the next blow would come from a voice that carried the weight of familiarity. "Claire," a man said as he approached, balancing his drink carefully, his cheeks already flushed from too much champagne. He was older now, heavier than she remembered, but the pin on his lapel gave him away. Thomas Myers, a longtime banker in town, someone her father had played golf with for years. He smiled kindly, though his words struck sharper than he intended. "Why didn't you ever tell them it was you who saved the house?" The question cut clean through the hum of nearby conversation, and though it wasn't shouted, it landed with the heaviness of revelation. A few heads turned. Claire blinked, caught off guard, and for a moment the glass in her hand trembled before she caught herself. "I'm sorry," she said carefully, though she knew exactly what he meant. Thomas chuckled, oblivious to the sudden stiffness in her posture. "Don't be modest. Everyone at the bank knew. That mortgage was seconds from collapse. And then out of nowhere the debt disappeared. I always admired the way you stepped in." "You were what, 25, 26? "It was remarkable." He leaned in, lowering his voice just slightly. "Why let them tell everyone it was a miracle when it was you who signed the check?" The clink of glasses, the shuffle of feet on the dance floor, all of it faded into the background as the words dragged her backward in time. She was 25 again, sitting in a cramped apartment in San Francisco, every cent she had poured into a fledgling startup that hadn't yet proven itself. She remembered the call from her mother, her voice shaky, her words clipped. "The bank says they'll foreclose. We could lose the house." The shame in her tone hadn't been about the house itself, but about what it would mean for Emily, no longer a picture-perfect daughter of a picture-perfect family. Claire had wired the money that same night quietly and without fanfare. It had meant postponing a crucial investment in her company, taking a risk that left her sleepless for weeks. But she had done it not because they had asked, but because she couldn't bear the thought of them losing the place that carried her childhood memories. She hadn't told anyone. Not her investors, not her friends, and certainly not her family. And then she remembered the words she overheard weeks later when she called to check in. Her father's voice calm and satisfied. It was Providence a miracle just when we needed it most. Her mother agreeing, eager to spread the story of divine timing. Emily chiming in, laughing. Of course, some people are just blessed. They had known. She had seen the acknowledgement in her father's eyes when she confronted him later. He hadn't denied it, but he had placed a hand on her shoulder and said quietly, "It's better this way. Your sister needs the light. Let her have it." Now standing in the center of Emily's grand wedding, those words echoed like a slap. Claire's gaze drifted across the room to where her parents sat. Emily's hand clasped in her mother's as though they were still shielding her from the world. Did they feel the shift, the danger in Thomas's words? Did they realize that the truth was crawling up through the cracks they had tried so carefully to plaster over? Her chest tightened, not from regret over what she had done, but from the bitterness of knowing how deliberately they had erased her part in it. She turned back to Thomas, her smile thin, her voice soft. "I never needed them to know," she said. That was enough. But it wasn't, and she knew it. The silence she had once worn like armor now felt like chains. They had taken her sacrifice and buried it, shaping it into a tale that suited them, one that cast Emily as the center while Claire was left as the shadow. Thomas seemed puzzled by her restraint, his brow furrowing. "You deserved the credit, Claire. I thought at least your parents would tell people the truth." "They didn't," she replied simply, her tone final. "And that was their choice." Guests nearby were listening now, though they pretended not to. Emily's name flickered in their whispers, but it wasn't paired with admiration anymore. It was curiosity, suspicion. If Claire had saved the house, what else had she done that had been stolen, disguised, or ignored? Claire held her head high, sipping her wine as though the revelation had not cracked something wide open inside her. Her mother's laughter rang from across the room, brittle and desperate, and her father avoided her eyes altogether. They had chosen to keep her silent. And she had chosen until now to let them. But silence comes with a price. The revelation about the house had spread like perfume through the air, subtle at first, but potent once it reached enough ears. Claire could see the way people looked at her now, with curiosity tinged with respect, and the way her parents shrank into their chairs, suddenly small beneath the weight of truth they had tried so hard to smother. Emily, though, was the one unraveling fastest. Her smile had grown sharp, her grip on her champagne glass white-knuckled, and her eyes darted toward Claire as though she were a trespasser who had stormed into her perfect tableau. The music faltered into silence as the band paused between songs, leaving the hum of conversation to fill the void. It was then Emily's voice tore through the air, shrill and panicked, splintering the fragile pretense of elegance. "She's stealing my wedding!" Emily shrieked, her voice echoing off the chandeliers. Her hand shot out toward Claire, her perfectly manicured finger trembling as it pointed. "This is supposed to be my day, and she's turning it into hers!" The words cracked through the room like thunder. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Glasses were frozen midway to lips, forks hovered above plates, and heads swiveled toward the bride who stood quaking in a storm of her own making. Then, almost comically, a stifled laugh broke the silence. One of the younger cousins at the back couldn't help himself, and the sound drew a ripple of uneasy chuckles from a few others. It was the sort of laughter people use when they don't know what else to do, the kind that only magnifies humiliation. Emily's face flushed crimson, her fury deepening as she realized that her outburst had made her the spectacle she so desperately feared. Claire sat still, her wineglass steady in her hand, her expression unreadable. She had no need to rise, no need to argue. Emily was doing the work for her, tearing apart her own image with every word. Claire let her sister's meltdown unfold her silence, a mirror that reflected Emily's hysteria for everyone to see. The guests shifted uncomfortably, whispering behind napkins and into ears. Some shook their heads, others smirked, and more than a few glanced toward Claire with sympathetic eyes. The contrast between the calm sister and the frantic bride was too stark to ignore. Emily, once the paragon of composure and grace, was now unraveling before them all. Her fiancé placed a tentative hand on her arm, murmuring something low and soothing, but Emily yanked away her veil, trembling with the force of her movement. "Don't you see?" she cried, her voice cracking. "She's been waiting for this. Waiting to humiliate me, to ruin everything I've worked for. She can't stand that I finally have the life she never could." The words hung in the air, jagged and raw. Claire felt the sting, but not for herself. It was Emily who had just exposed the venom beneath her polished exterior. For years she had played the golden child, basking in praise and affection. Now in one breath she revealed how deeply she feared losing it all. The laughter from earlier died away, replaced with stunned silence. Guests stared at the bride as though seeing her for the first time, the cracks in her perfect facade yawning wide. Claire's parents shifted uncomfortably, her mother clutching at pearls, her father staring at the floor as if wishing it would swallow him whole. Claire tilted her head, meeting her sister's blazing eyes across the space. She said nothing because there was nothing she needed to add. Emily's words had painted the picture more vividly than Claire ever could. She was not the victim. She was a desperate woman clawing at attention, terrified of being overshadowed. But Emily wasn't finished. She drew in a ragged breath, her voice dropping lower, sharper, as though she was about to slice through the last veil of civility that separated public shame from devastation. The guests leaned in, bracing, sensing that whatever came next would leave a mark none of them could ignore. But her next words revealed something darker. The silence after Emily's outburst hung heavy, an uncomfortable weight pressing down on every guest in the ballroom. People shifted in their seats, unsure whether to look at the bride unraveling before them or at Claire, who remained composed, her glass poised delicately between her fingers. The music had long since stopped, and the only sound was the uneven rhythm of Emily's breath. Her face flushed, her eyes wild. It was clear she was on the brink of saying something she would never be able to take back, but she seemed too far gone to stop herself. And then it happened. Her voice, shrill and sharp, cracked through the air. "That company was my idea first." The words struck like a lightning bolt, stunning the room into stillness. For a moment, even the reporters outside seemed to fall quiet, as though the entire world had tilted to catch the confession that had just been shouted in a fit of rage. Forks slipped from fingers, a glass toppled and rolled across the floor, and the gasp that rose from the crowd was collective and loud. Claire did not move. She let the silence stretch her sister's words, echoing in the vaulted ceiling. She wanted everyone in that room to hear it, to let it sink in. The golden child, the bride in white lace and diamonds, had just ripped her own veil of perfection to shreds. The guests' eyes darted from Emily to Claire and back again, as if they were trying to stitch together a story that made sense of what they had just heard. Emily's chest heaved, and she seemed to realize too late the gravity of her outburst. Her mouth opened as if to backtrack, to patch over the hole she had torn, but the damage was irreversible. The whispers began immediately, harsh and incredulous. Did she just admit that her idea I thought Claire was the founder? Why would she say that on her own wedding night? Claire finally set her glass down with deliberate calm, her hand steady. She leaned back slightly in her chair, her gaze fixed on Emily, with the kind of cool detachment that cut deeper than anger ever could. And when she spoke, her voice was low, but sharp enough to pierce every corner of the room. "You've always loved taking what isn't yours." The words carried a weight that no one missed. Guests froze mid-whisper, drawn in by the venom wrapped in Claire's composure. Emily flinched, her face contorting as if she had been slapped. The silence that followed was not empty, it was thick, charged with the collective realization of who Emily really was. Her fiancé turned sharply to face her, his jaw tight, his brows drawn together in a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. "What does she mean, Emily?" His voice was quiet, but it carried. The eyes of the entire room pinned Emily in place, waiting for her answer. Emily stammered, her polished exterior crumbling. I just meant, we talked about ideas when we were younger. I was the one who—" But her voice faltered under the weight of so many watching eyes, under the sheer disbelief painted across the faces of people who had once adored her. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Someone near the front muttered, "So she's been lying all along." Another voice tinged with disbelief. "And she let Claire be humiliated tonight." The tide had turned, and Emily was powerless to stop it. Claire didn't press further. She didn't need to. Her sister had already condemned herself with her own tongue. All Claire had to do was sit there, serene and unflinching, while the room shifted in her favor. It was Emily who twisted under the scrutiny, who clutched at her gown as though fabric could anchor her against the rising flood of judgment. Her mother half rose from her chair, her lips parting as if to rush in with a defense, but her father's hand pressed down on her arm, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the floor. Even he knew there was no saving Emily from what she had just unleashed. Emily's fiancé's voice rose again, this time harder, edged with anger. "Is that true? Emily? Was it her idea?" His words lashed at her, public and damning. The guests leaned forward, hungry for the truth, eager to see what the perfect bride would say when there was nowhere left to hide. Claire's lips curved into the faintest smile, not triumphant, not mocking, but resolute. This was not a victory she had engineered, it was one Emily had delivered herself, wrapped in her own desperation and pride. And that Claire thought made it all the more devastating. Emily opened her mouth again, but no sound came out. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for an ally, for anyone who might salvage her unraveling image. But the faces she met were no longer admiring or sympathetic. They were skeptical, even disgusted. And in that moment, the truth was laid bare for everyone to see. The cracks in Emily's polished veneer, the ones Claire had known existed all along, now spread wide under the harsh light of reality. Now everyone could see the cracks in the sister they once idolized. The room was still quaking with the shock of Emily's outburst when her fiancé finally pushed back his chair. The scrape of wood against the polished floor was sharp, and the sound alone made every head turn toward him. His face was set, his jaw clenched, and when he spoke, his voice carried the clipped precision of a man who had just realized the ground beneath him was not solid, but riddled with fault lines. "Is it true?" he asked, each word deliberate as he fixed his eyes on Emily. Was the company really her idea first? The silence that followed was brutal. Emily's lips parted, but no sound came. She tried to smile, but her face twitched with the effort, and the lie caught in her throat. I may have mentioned some things once, she stammered, but Claire she didn't have the discipline to make it real. I was the one who— Stop. His voice cut her off like a blade. His eyes narrowed as if he were seeing her clearly for the first time. "Do not lie to me. Not here. Not now." Gasps rippled through the guests. The bride, still in her gown, was being interrogated in front of family, friends, and strangers alike, and there was no graceful way out. Emily's hands fumbled at the edge of the tablecloth, twisting it as though she could wring the truth back into submission. And then he dropped the weight she wasn't prepared for. "Do you know why I believed you?" His voice was steady, but it trembled with contained fury. "Because I invested in you. I put money into your so-called company. I trusted your vision. You told me it was yours, Emily. Yours. Do you understand what you've done?" The words landed like hammer blows. Guests leaned forward, some pressing hands to mouths, others muttering under their breath. The bride, who had been the embodiment of perfection, was now accused not only of theft, but of fraud. Emily's eyes darted wildly as though she might find a friendly face, but all she found were expressions of shock and thinly veiled contempt. Her fiancé's voice grew louder, sharper. "Do you realize what it means that you built this on a stolen idea, that you used my money, our future, to prop up a lie?" He shook his head, almost laughing, though there was no humor in the sound. "This isn't just betrayal, Emily. This is fraud. And I won't be the man who stands next to a fraud." Emily stumbled to her feet, her gown dragging against the floor as she reached for him. "Please don't say that," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You don't understand. I had to. Claire always made me feel small. I just wanted—" But he stepped back out of her reach, his face hard. "Don't you dare make this about her. You lied to me. You built your entire story on lies." He turned then suddenly to Claire. His eyes met hers, and for the first time there was no polite curiosity, no detached admiration. There was urgency, almost desperation. "Claire, tell me, was it your idea? Was it yours first?" The weight of the room shifted again. Every gaze swung to Claire, waiting hungry for the truth that only she could deliver. Claire sat perfectly still, her posture regal, her eyes steady. She did not rush to answer. She let the silence stretch until it felt like the very air might crack. And then, with quiet authority, she said, "Yes, it was mine. She knew it then, and she knows it now." The collective exhale was audible, as though the entire room had been holding its breath. Emily let out a strangled sob, covering her face with trembling hands. Her fiancé's shoulders squared, his expression grim. "Then I have my answer," he said coldly. He turned back to Emily, his voice carrying the final blow. "We are done. There will be no wedding, not tonight, not ever. And you should know, Emily, I intend to speak with my attorneys. I will not lose my money to your deceit. If necessary, I will take this to court. And Claire." He turned once more to her, his tone softening, almost imploring. "I may need you as a witness. I hope you'll help me see this through." Emily's knees buckled and she sank back into her chair, as though her gown itself had grown too heavy to bear. Her veil slipped askew, her makeup streaked with tears, and the image of the perfect bride collapsed before them all. Guests whispered openly now, their voices tinged with judgment and disdain. The humiliation was complete, and it was hers alone. Claire said nothing more. She didn't need to. Her sister's carefully woven tapestry of lies was shredding under its own weight, pulled apart thread by thread. Emily's perfect life unraveled thread by thread. Her mother had always been adept at slipping into scenes when the spotlight turned harsh, smoothing edges, soothing egos, and patching cracks before anyone else could see them. Tonight, though, the cracks were too wide, the spotlight too bright. As Emily wept in her ruined gown and guests muttered about lawsuits and fraud, Claire felt a hand clamp around her wrist, firm and trembling. She turned to find her mother's face pale, her lipstick slightly smudged, her eyes darting nervously to make sure no one was watching. Without a word, her mother tugged her away from the center of the room, away from the whispers and the photographers, into a dim corner near the service hallway, where the music no longer reached. "Claire," her mother whispered urgently, clutching her hands as though they were lifelines. "Please, you have to stop this. Don't destroy this night. Don't destroy your sister." The plea was sharp with desperation, but also with something darker, self-preservation. Claire recognized it instantly, the same tone her mother had used years ago when she begged her to stay quiet about the stolen idea about the house payment, about every wound the family had inflicted. It wasn't Emily her mother was trying to save. It was the image, the facade of perfection that had always mattered more than truth. Claire's eyes narrowed. She pulled her hands free slowly, deliberately, as though casting off a shackle. "Don't destroy this night." Her voice was low, but the bitterness in it burned. "Tell me, Mother, what exactly have I destroyed?" I didn't put words in Emily's mouth. I didn't force her to confess in front of everyone. I didn't build her entire life on lies. She did that herself. Her mother flinched as though struck, but pressed on her voice, rising with frantic urgency. "People don't need to know every detail. Families keep things inside. What's done is done, and dragging it out in public only shames us all. For God's sake, Claire, think about the family's reputation. Think about me." Claire's laugh was short and bitter, a sound with no joy in it. "That's what you're worried about. Not the fact that you stood by while Emily stole from me. Not the years you let everyone call me a failure while I carried your burdens. You're worried about appearances." Her mother's lips trembled, but her eyes hardened. Emily was always the one people looked to. She was going to carry this family's name forward. You were different. We needed to protect her, to let her shine. There it was, spoken aloud at last. The truth Claire had always known, but hearing it now in this cold hallway, stripped of excuses and softening, made her stomach twist. She shook her head slowly. "Protect her. You didn't protect her, Mother. You built her into a fragile glass doll and told her the world would never see her flaws. You let her believe she could take, and you thought the truth would never catch up. But it always does." Her mother reached for her again, her hands trembling. "Please, Claire, I'm begging you. If you have any love for this family at all, let this go. Don't humiliate us further." Claire stepped back, her chin lifting, her voice steady with years of pent-up defiance. "I have given more to this family than you will ever admit. I paid debts you pretended were miracles. I stayed silent when you told me silence was best. I let you erase me, Mother, because I thought maybe, just maybe, it would make you love me. And still you stand here and call me the destroyer." Her eyes burned, but she refused to let tears fall. "I didn't destroy anything. I didn't ruin this day. You did. You and the lies you chose to protect." Her mother's face crumpled, the first crack in her own polished mask showing as she whispered, "If you keep going like this, Claire, you'll tear the whole family apart." Claire's reply came sharp, final, ringing like glass breaking. "I'm not tearing it apart. I'm revealing what was already broken." For a long moment, neither woman moved. Guests' voices drifted from the ballroom, muffled but tense, carrying the knowledge that the night was already ruined beyond repair. Her mother's hands fell uselessly to her sides, her eyes shining with something between fear and resentment. And Claire, standing taller than she ever had in her mother's presence, felt the weight of years lift. She was not the villain of this story. She was not the one who had planted the lies or nurtured the rot. She was simply the mirror now held up to the truth. But I was not the destroyer they were. The moment with my mother still stung as I moved through the crowded hall, her desperate whisper echoing in my mind. I had barely shaken off the bitterness of that exchange when I caught sight of Mark standing near the bar, a drink in his hand, his eyes fixed on me with a look I couldn't quite decipher. There was hesitation in his stance, as though he was weighing whether to approach, and for a second I considered walking past him without a word. But something in his expression stopped me, something that told me he was carrying more than just polite small talk. He finally stepped closer, his voice low and strained, almost breaking under the weight of what he needed to say. "Claire," he murmured, "there's something I should have told you years ago. Something about Emily. And us." I froze, my pulse quickening. Mark had been my anchor during those uncertain years in college, the person who had believed in me when no one else did. When our relationship abruptly ended, the pain was sharp and confusing. I had told myself he'd simply fallen out of love, that life had pulled us apart. To hear now in this room, thick with laughter and hypocrisy, that Emily had been part of that fracture, it was almost too much to absorb. I forced myself to meet his eyes. "What do you mean?" My voice was measured, though inside I felt a familiar storm building. Mark looked down at his glass, then back at me, his face tense. "She told me lies, Claire. She said you never really cared about me, that you were using me to feel important while you chased ideas that would never go anywhere. She made it sound as though you laughed at me behind my back." His words landed like a blow. I remembered the nights I had spent writing proposals, sketching out plans, confiding in him about dreams no one else respected. He had been the one person I trusted with my rawest hopes, and to hear that Emily had twisted that trust into a weapon cut deeper than I could express. The shock rendered me momentarily speechless. I wanted to deny it had happened, to tell him he should have known better, but even as the anger flared, a darker truth settled over me. This wasn't new. Emily had always had a talent for undermining me, for whispering poison in just the right ears, for turning others against me while keeping her hands clean. It was how she had survived, how she had thrived, by burying me under her shadow. I looked at Mark again, searching for guilt or cowardice, and found both written across his face. "Why didn't you come to me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why didn't you ask me if it was true?" He winced, as though he had expected the question and dreaded it. I was young, insecure, and she knew exactly where to strike. "She made me believe you were too ambitious, that I would only ever be second to your dreams. And when she added that you had been confiding in someone else, I believed her. I should have trusted you. I didn't. And I've regretted it every day since." His admission brought back years of loneliness I had forced myself to bury. The late nights when my phone stayed silent, the mornings I had to pick myself up and keep going without a hand to hold all, while Emily smiled sweetly, as though she had nothing to do with my pain. The revelation was a cruel kind of vindication. On one hand, it explained the sudden unraveling of a love I thought unshakable. On the other, it exposed Emily's malice in ways I had never fully grasped. It wasn't enough for her to steal my ideas. She had wanted to steal my happiness, too. I clenched my hands at my sides, nails pressing into my palms as memories cascaded through me. Moments where Emily had smiled too brightly when Mark avoided me, times she comforted me with words that now felt laced with mockery. She had orchestrated it all, and I had been blind. Mark leaned in, his voice urgent, as though he needed me to believe him before it was too late. "I see now how she's always wanted to eclipse you. Tonight, it's all coming back. I can't stand by anymore without telling you the truth. You deserve to know what she did, Claire." His sincerity was evident, and yet it brought me little comfort. What good were regrets whispered years too late? What good was his apology now when the scars had already hardened? Still, his confession added another layer to the night's revelations, another brick in the crumbling facade of Emily's supposed perfection. I drew in a slow breath, steadying myself. "You let her win," I said, the bitterness slipping into my voice. "You let her destroy what we had." And she reveled in it. His face fell, shame shadowing his features. He didn't argue, didn't defend himself. He only nodded, as though accepting the full weight of his failure. The silence between us stretched heavy and unyielding, until finally I stepped back, creating a small but deliberate distance. I needed air. I needed space to process the scope of her betrayal, to add this new wound to the long list she had carved into my life. Around us, the party continued in fractured splendor, guests still whispering about the headline that had shattered the evening. But in that moment, their chatter faded into a dull hum. All I could hear was the echo of Emily's voice from years ago, weaving lies that had cost me love, trust, and peace. I thought I had already known the worst of her, that her theft of my ideas was the deepest cut. Now I realized she had been dismantling me piece by piece long before I ever suspected. It wasn't just envy. It was something darker, something rooted in a need to see me, diminished, broken, forgotten. As I turned away from Mark, my chest tight with grief and fury, I felt the truth settle into me like ice. Emily's betrayal wasn't a single act, wasn't even a handful of cruel decisions. It was a pattern, a relentless campaign woven through the fabric of my life. I had underestimated her malice, underestimated how far she would go to strip me of what I cherished. I had always thought of her as careless and selfish, but this was calculated. This was deliberate. This was a truth I could no longer ignore. The betrayal ran deeper than I had ever imagined. The room still buzzed from Mark's confession, his words hanging in the air like smoke that no one dared wave away. Emily had vanished for a moment, her face blotched with humiliation while whispers rippled from table to table. I stayed at my seat, steadying myself with calm breaths, refusing to give in to the chaos swirling around me. That was when the master of ceremonies, a man who had probably expected nothing more dramatic from the evening than to announce the cake, cutting tapped his microphone with a nervous smile. And now he said, his voice straining to regain control of the room, a few words from the bride's sister Claire. Every head turned toward me at once. It wasn't a polite glance. It was a collective demand, an unspoken insistence that I reveal myself, that I justify the storm already raging. My heart pounded, but it wasn't fear that drove the rhythm. It was clarity. For years I had kept my head down, my voice subdued, swallowing the indignities doled out by my own family. And now, under the heavy chandeliers and among the clatter of champagne glasses, I felt something ignite. This was not just a wedding toast. It was a reckoning. I rose slowly, letting the scrape of my chair against the polished floor cut through the whispers. The microphone felt cold in my hand, and when I lifted my eyes, I saw Emily lurking near the edge of the dance floor, her face stiff with dread. My parents sat rigid at their table, their posture betraying their hope that I would be brief, polite, forgettable. But I had no intention of being any of those things. Thank you. I began, my voice steady but low, drawing the guests closer with its restraint rather than volume. Weddings are meant to be about love, unity, and family, but they are also about truth. And sometimes I paused, letting my gaze linger on my parents. The truth is harder to hear than the vows themselves. A murmur spread, quickly silenced when I continued. I grew up in this family always being told what I wasn't. I wasn't as pretty. I wasn't as accomplished. I wasn't as loved. My sister was the star, the pride, the chosen one. And I let out a small, sharp laugh. I was the shadow. My words echoed more bitterly than I had planned, but the silence that followed confirmed I had struck the nerve I aimed for. Emily bristled, opening her mouth as if to interrupt, but her fiancé laid a hand on her arm, restraining her with more pity than affection. The gesture fueled me. I turned to the guests, their faces now a blend of discomfort and fascination. When you are told often enough that you don't matter, you learn to stop trying to be heard. You learn to make peace with silence. But silence does not mean weakness. Sometimes silence is where strength is forged. My eyes swept the room, catching on the people who had chuckled at me earlier, those who had whispered unemployed like it was my entire identity. Their expressions shifted now, uneasy, guilty, exposed. The words came more freely, each sentence a release of years of bitterness pressed into my bones. Favoritism corrodes families. It turns siblings into rivals, parents into tyrants, and children into ghosts. I was made into a ghost so that Emily could shine brighter. But ghosts don't stay silent forever. Eventually they return to tell their story. A collective intake of breath followed, and I could feel every eye locking onto me. I didn't need to name names, didn't need to shout. The sharpness of my tone carried the weight of every insult, every dismissal. Success is not measured by who gets the applause in this room, I said. It's measured by the strength to endure, to rise, to create when no one believes you can. My voice rose slightly, just enough to fill the space without breaking into a scream. And make no mistake, I have created. Not to prove anyone wrong, but because I believed in myself when no one else did. I caught Emily's eye. Her jaw was clenched, her cheeks mottled with fury. She was trembling, caught between rage and fear of losing control in front of her guests. I let the silence stretch a beat too long, forcing her to sit in the discomfort she had never endured before. From somewhere in the back, a fork clattered against a plate, startlingly loud in the stillness. But no one laughed. No one dared. They were listening rapt, hanging on every word as if I had rewritten the evening from celebration to tribunal. I softened my voice deliberately for the final blow, each word deliberate, sharp as glass. For too long, lies have been celebrated here. Lies about who deserves love, who deserves success, who deserves respect. But lies, I leaned slightly closer to the microphone, do not endure. Truth does. The air was so tight it felt like the walls themselves leaned in to hear what came next. I lifted the champagne flute in my hand, the bubbles catching the chandelier light like sparks. My hand was steady, my voice unwavering. So tonight, I said, pausing just long enough to let the anticipation build to a breaking point. I propose a toast. My eyes locked on Emily, then flicked to my parents before sweeping the room in one slow arc. Here's to the end of deceit, I declared. May it choke on its own silence. And as the room erupted into a stunned, suffocating hush, I raised my glass higher, sealing the words with the weight of years unspoken. Then I raised my glass to the end of deceit. Gasps filled the air as my words still echoed the final ring of my glass, hanging like judgment above the room. For a few suspended seconds, no one moved, no one spoke. Then, from the center of it all came the sound of fabric rustling sharply, followed by a raw, strangled cry. Emily stood there, eyes wild, her perfectly crafted mask cracked wide open. The image of the composed bride, the golden daughter, the flawless star dissolved in a single moment of desperation. Her sob burst out jagged and uncontrollable, reverberating off the chandeliered ceiling. Makeup streaked down her cheeks, the mascara mixing with her tears, until she resembled a woman unraveling rather than a bride glowing. She staggered back her heels, catching the hem of her gown, and let out a high-pitched wail that silenced the remaining murmurs. People turned to one another, their faces caught between pity and disdain, but no one stepped forward to comfort her, not even my mother. Emily clutched her bouquet as though it could anchor her petals trembling in her grip before she hurled it to the floor. It scattered across the polished surface like pieces of her composure. Then she spun her veil, whipping behind her, and bolted toward the exit. The sound of her heels striking the floor in uneven, desperate beats echoed like a drum of retreat. By the time the doors swung shut behind her, the silence she left behind was louder than her screams. The guests began whispering, first hesitantly, then more freely, like a current of judgment surging through the hall. I can't believe it. All that show and now this, I never thought she'd break like that. Their voices layered one over another until they were no longer whispers, but the roar of disapproval. The admiration Emily had once commanded, the envy she had relished, melted into collective disappointment. The empire she had built with her charm and deceit crumbled in real time with her audience watching every fracture. I stood rooted, my glass still raised, but I lowered it slowly, deliberately reclaiming control of the moment. My heart did not pound with guilt, only with the startling realization that the balance had shifted completely. For once, I was not the one squirming under the spotlight, not the one shrinking into shadows. I was steady. I was unshaken. The shame for once was not mine to carry. Beside me, Emily's fiancé remained in his chair, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed firmly on me rather than on the door his bride had just stormed through. Guests noticed. I noticed. He had not run after her. He had not even moved. His silence spoke volumes louder than if he had declared the engagement over right then. By staying, he made a choice, whether deliberate or instinctual, it was clear to everyone watching. He had aligned himself with me, not with Emily. I could feel the weight of stares pressing into my skin, the recognition dawning on every face. The whispers shifted again now, tinged with something darker, confirmation that the perfect sister was no longer untouchable. Her unraveling was complete. Her downfall laid bare. Across the room, my father sank into his chair, his face pale as stone, his hand pressed to his temple. My mother fiddled with the edge of her napkin, her lips pinched tight, unwilling to acknowledge the spectacle her favorite daughter had become. Their silence condemned them more than words ever could. The pride they had flaunted all these years had imploded, and all they had left was the wreckage of their own favoritism played out before an audience too large to ignore. I watched the door through which Emily had fled, the heavy wood still swaying slightly from the force with which she had pushed it open. Part of me expected her to storm back in, to lash out, to claw back what dignity she could salvage. But deep down, I knew she couldn't. Not yet. She had been stripped too bare, exposed too fully. And yet another part of me, a colder, wiser part, knew she wasn't gone for good. People like Emily never surrendered in silence. They schemed, they clawed, they reinvented their weapons. As the guests began to shift uncomfortably as waiters cleared plates, no one had touched as cameras flashed discreetly to capture the wreck of a wedding that would surely be whispered about for years. I inhaled slowly and let the taste of vindication settle on my tongue. I had endured years of humiliation, years of dismissal, years of being erased. Tonight, Emily had finally borne the weight of her own cruelty, and the sight of it was more powerful than any revenge I had imagined. But even as I allowed myself that small triumph, a ripple of unease crept in. The story wasn't over. I knew the look in her eyes before she fled, the wild, desperate fire of someone cornered but not yet defeated. Her downfall had been public, humiliating, undeniable, yet the war she waged had always been waged in the shadows with whispers, manipulations, and poison-tipped secrets. And I had no illusions Emily would not vanish quietly into disgrace. Her perfect life lay in tatters, but she wasn't finished yet. The ballroom had begun to settle into a strange, uneasy quiet after Emily's storming exit. Guests whispered in small clusters, speculating about what they had just witnessed, their voices carrying a mixture of shock, pity, and smug delight that the golden daughter had finally cracked. I stood rooted in place, my hands folded around the cool stem of my glass, my eyes steady on the door she had burst through. I should have expected it. Really, I knew Emily better than anyone. Humiliation was not an ending for her. It was fuel. And sure enough, before the murmurs could fade completely, the heavy doors swung open once again. She walked back into the room, her face blotched from tears, mascara streaks hastily smeared with trembling fingers. The proud veil was gone, discarded somewhere in her frantic flight. What remained was a woman fighting desperately to hold together the scraps of her dignity. Yet even in her disheveled state, Emily carried herself as though she could rewrite what had just happened. That was her talent, spinning illusion from wreckage. The room hushed again, guests craning to see what she would do. Instead of returning to her seat beside her fiancé, who now sat stiffly at a table near me, Emily walked straight toward me. The sharp click of her heels, uneven from haste, echoed like the drumbeat of a hollow march. Every eye followed her until she reached me, and before I could step aside, she flung her arms around me in a sudden, exaggerated embrace. "She has always supported me the most," Emily cried out, her voice pitched high enough to carry to the furthest corners of the hall. She clung to me, her body trembling, her words spilling with false warmth. "My sister, my Claire. She has never once stopped believing in me. Through everything, she's been my rock." Her tears wet my shoulder, hot and performative, and I stood stiff in her grasp, not returning the embrace. The guests erupted in a wave of startled murmurs, the kind that carried suspicion more than sympathy. They had seen her collapse only moments ago. They had heard the venom she had spewed earlier in the evening. And now here she was, suddenly declaring me her greatest supporter, clutching me as if our years of rivalry and cruelty could be erased with a single melodramatic gesture. Some guests exchanged knowing glances, their lips pursed with doubt. Others raised their brows, clearly unconvinced. A few even smirked, recognizing the performance for what it was, a desperate act to salvage a reputation already crumbling. I didn't move. I didn't push her away, nor did I return the embrace. I simply stood silent, watching the spectacle unfold. My restraint was deliberate. I knew better than to meet theatrics with theatrics. Let her dig her own grave. Let her reveal herself further. I could feel her fiancé's eyes on us, sharp and cold, his jaw clenched as though every word she uttered deepened his contempt. Claire has always loved me, Emily continued, still clinging tightly. She has been my protector, my biggest fan. I wouldn't be here without her. Her voice cracked as though sincerity weighed heavily on it, but the effect fell flat. There was no chorus of applause, no soft sighs of admiration from the audience. Instead, there was silence broken only by the rustle of skirts and the scrape of chairs as people shifted uncomfortably. Her performance was unraveling, and she knew it. Her grip on me tightened, nails digging lightly into my arm, her whispered voice hot against my ear, now low enough for only me to hear. "Play along," she hissed. "If you care about this family, you'll play along." I didn't answer. My silence was sharper than any retort. I let her words hang in the space between us, and then I slowly drew back just enough to look into her face. Her eyes were wide, glittering with fear and fury, the desperation of someone who felt the ground crumbling beneath her. The guests noticed the stiffness of my posture, the absence of warmth in my expression. They noticed that my arms remained firmly at my sides, not returning the embrace. And in their noticing suspicion hardened into certainty, Emily's act was nothing more than that, an act. A few whispers carried clearly across the silence. "She's lying. It doesn't add up." Didn't she just scream at her sister? The tide of public opinion already against her was turning harsher by the second. Emily tried to smile, the corners of her mouth trembling as she held on to me like a drowning woman clinging to driftwood. "She loves me," she repeated loudly, her voice breaking. "She always has." But her insistence only amplified the doubt in the room. The more she spoke, the less anyone believed her. I stayed silent, waiting, knowing the moment was coming. I didn't need to expose her. I didn't need to push back. The truth had a way of surfacing, and Emily was too reckless, too desperate to keep it buried for long. And then, as if the universe itself conspired to strip her mask away, movement stirred at the back of the hall. Heads turned, murmurs spread, and I felt the tension sharpen like a blade. The very evidence she feared, the truth she had fought so long to suppress, was about to appear. Then the evidence appeared, proving she had done the opposite. The silence after Emily's desperate declaration still lingered thick and brittle when a low crackle broke through the tension. At first it sounded like feedback from the speakers, a stray hum of interference. Heads turned toward the sound system set up near the bandstand. The guests shifted uneasily, curious and confused, until a man's voice, smooth, practiced, unmistakably confident, filled the hall. It was Mark. He stood near the controls, his hand steady as he adjusted the microphone, but it wasn't his present voice that first commanded attention. It was his voice from years ago, captured in a recording accompanied by another that chilled the air. Emily's. On the speakers, Emily's laughter rang out, carefree, careless, dripping with arrogance. Oh, that idea. It wasn't mine. It was Claire's. But she was too naive, too dreamy. She needed a lesson. So I took it and ran with it. That'll teach her not to get ahead of herself. The words slammed into the room like a physical blow. Gasps rippled across the tables, silverware clattered to plates, and the murmur of disbelief rose like a storm. People craned their necks, their eyes darting between the trembling bride and the speakers, as if needing to confirm with their own ears what they had just heard. Emily froze. Her mouth opened, but no words emerged. Her face drained of color, her painted lips trembling as the weight of her own confession filled the room. She had always been so skilled at deflection, so practiced at twisting the truth until it bent to her advantage. But here now, her own voice betrayed her, preserved in cold permanence. Mark's present voice cut through the noise, calm and deliberate. This was recorded during a meeting with a potential investor years ago. She never knew the recorder was running. I kept it because I thought one day the truth would matter. He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the stunned guests. That day is today. A stunned hush fell over the crowd. Even the clinking of glasses and shuffling of feet ceased as if the room itself held its breath. Emily stammered finally, her words jagged. It's out of context. You can't. But the weakness in her voice betrayed her. The conviction she once wielded so effortlessly had fled, leaving her a hollow echo of the woman who had strutted through life untouchable. The guests whispered harshly now, no longer cautious. She admitted it. All these years it was Claire's. Unbelievable. What kind of sister does that? The tide had turned irreversible and merciless. I stood motionless, my pulse thrumming in my ears, watching her unravel with each passing second. And yet beneath my vindication, a small, sharp thorn of unease pricked at me. Why had Mark kept this all these years? Why had he waited until now, in this very moment, to reveal it? His timing was perfect for maximum devastation, but it was also damning. He had let me suffer years of humiliation, years of being branded a dreamer while holding the very proof that could have cleared my name. I caught his eyes across the room. He looked back at me, steady, unreadable. For the first time, I wondered whether he was my ally or simply another man choosing the moment that suited him best. But the guests weren't thinking about Mark. Their attention was fixed entirely on Emily, the woman they had admired, envied, and praised. The facade had cracked earlier, but now it shattered completely. She sank into a chair, her trembling hands clutching the edge of the table as if it might keep her from sliding into the abyss. Tears welled again, but this time they didn't inspire sympathy. They only amplified the disgust and disappointment radiating from every corner of the hall. My mother's face collapsed in mortification, her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line as she avoided every pair of eyes that might look her way. My father leaned back, shoulders slumped as though the weight of his misplaced pride had finally broken him. Their golden child had been exposed not by rivals, not by strangers, but by her own arrogance. I felt a strange calm settle over me. I hadn't needed to raise my voice, hadn't needed to deliver the killing blow. Emily had done it to herself, and Mark had simply provided the knife. The vindication was sharp, but it was not sweet. It was sobering. Years of deceit, manipulation, and favoritism lay in ruins at her feet. Emily tried once more, her voice cracking. It was just a joke, I didn't mean. But the words dissolved into a sob, pitiful and hollow. No one believed her. The lie was too large, too blatant, too undeniable. Her empire had been built on stolen dreams and false promises, and with one recording, it collapsed into rubble. The air vibrated with the finality of it. Guests turned away, no longer willing to watch the wreckage of her performance. Conversations shifted to tones of disgust and condemnation. She was no longer the admired bride, no longer the pride of the family. She was the cautionary tale unfolding before their very eyes. I lowered my gaze for a moment, inhaling deeply, letting the weight of the moment sink in. This wasn't just Emily's humiliation, it was the undoing of years of being silenced, belittled, dismissed. For the first time, the truth was undeniable, and as I lifted my eyes again to the broken figure of my sister, mascara streaking her cheeks, lips trembling, body hunched as though shielding herself from the stares that cut sharper than knives, I knew there was no going back. Her empire of lies shattered before our eyes. The ballroom still trembled with the echo of Emily's downfall, the weight of the recording heavy in the air. The whispers had slowed, though the judgment lingered, pressing against every corner of the room. I stood frozen, not because of Emily's disgrace that was inevitable, but because of the man I could feel staring at me across the crowd. My father. His silence had always cut sharper than words, but now his face was pale, his jaw clenched, and his eyes were fixed on me with something I had never seen before. He rose slowly from his chair, the scrape of wood against the floor startling in the heavy quiet. Conversations ceased. The hum of speculation was replaced by a tense, expectant stillness. Everyone's attention shifted to him. This was not a man prone to making speeches or baring his heart. My father had built his reputation on reserve control and unshakable pride. That he now stood visibly shaken drew every pair of eyes in the room. His voice was gravely weighted with years of things unsaid. Enough, he muttered first as if to himself, but then louder. Enough lies. Enough pretending. His gaze did not leave me as he continued each word deliberate like stones dropped into water. Claire deserves to hear the truth. You all do. My breath caught. My body stiffened, bracing for whatever was coming, though part of me already knew. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting briefly to Emily, then back to me. Years ago, when you both were still young, I made a choice. Not because it was fair, not because it was right, but because I thought it was necessary. His words faltered, but he forced them forward. You had ideas, Claire. You had vision. I saw it even if I didn't say it. But Emily, she needed to shine. She needed to be the star. And so I told you to step back. I told you to let her lead. I told you in no uncertain terms that there was only room for one daughter in the light. The silence that followed was suffocating. Gasps rippled through the guests, their heads swiveling toward me with pity toward him, with disbelief. He had spoken aloud the very thing I had felt in my bones for years, but had never heard confirmed. It was as though the air itself shifted, validating my pain in a way I hadn't thought possible. My chest ached, my throat tight, but a strange lightness began to seep in. The wound was deep, yes, but there was relief in the truth finally being spoken, no matter how cruel. My father, the man whose approval I had longed for my entire life, had finally admitted it. I had not imagined the favoritism. I had not been paranoid. I had been deliberately silenced, deliberately pushed aside. I thought it was for the good of the family, he went on, his voice thick, his eyes glistening in a way I had never seen before. Emily was fragile. She thrived on praise, and I feared what would happen if she didn't have it. You were strong. I told myself you didn't need it. But I was wrong. God help me, I was so wrong. My mother shifted uncomfortably beside him, her face crimson, but she said nothing. She stared at the tablecloth, refusing to meet my eyes. He pressed on. I let her take things from you. I let her stand on your shoulders while I told myself you'd find another way. I thought I was protecting the family, but what I did was betray you. The last word hit me harder than any insult ever had. Betray. My own father admitting he had chosen deception, had chosen to wound me for the sake of maintaining Emily's fragile illusion of greatness. I stood perfectly still, my hands numb at my sides, my eyes locked on him. The guests watched with rapt attention, many of them shaking their heads in disbelief. Some whispered, "No wonder." Others simply sat stunned into silence by the sheer audacity of his confession. Pain radiated through me, but beneath it a quiet strength began to bloom. For years I had doubted myself, wondering if I had exaggerated, if perhaps I had been oversensitive, if my failures in their eyes had been my fault alone. But here it was, the truth. Spoken not in whispers behind closed doors, but publicly in front of every person who had ever dismissed me as lesser. I exhaled slowly, tasting the salt of tears I hadn't realized had formed in my eyes. Relief and grief mingled in my chest, heavy but cleansing. The man who had molded so much of my pain had laid it bare for all to see. The ballroom had gone utterly still. No clinking glasses, no shifting chairs, no rustling whispers. Only silence thick and profound, as if every guest knew they were standing at the edge of something irreversible. My father's shoulders sagged as he sank back into his chair, the weight of his confession pressing him down. He looked older than I had ever seen him, diminished by the truth he had carried for so long. He did not meet my eyes again. I stood steady and quiet, my mind whirring. The years of silence, of swallowing my truth, of carrying my pain without acknowledgement, had ended in this moment. But my silence ended tonight. The air in the reception hall was so heavy, you could almost feel it pressing against your chest. The echoes of her father's confession still lingered like smoke, curling through the silence, staining the faces of the family who had prided themselves for years on perfection. People shifted in their seats, the clinking of glasses and utensils now long forgotten, as if the whole event had frozen into a living portrait of shock. Claire, who had endured a lifetime of being ignored, finally stood at the center of it all, not by accident, not by luck, but by a power she had carved for herself. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to argue. Instead, she let the silence do the work. Her lips curved into a small smile, calm, measured, deliberate. It was not the smile of triumph shouted from rooftops, but the kind of smile that unsettles those who know they've misjudged you for far too long. It was enough to make her mother fumble with her pearls, to make her father glance away, and to send a ripple of whispers through the room. That smile carried the weight of everything unspoken, the years of belittlement, the endless comparisons, the nights she had cried alone. Her parents, the self-proclaimed arbiters of worth in their family, could no longer hold her gaze. The father who once told her she would find her way someday now lowered his head as though the floorboards were suddenly fascinating. Her mother, always quick to boast of Emily's every accomplishment, kept her eyes fixed on the tablecloth, tracing invisible patterns with her fingers, her cheeks flushed, not with pride this time, but with shame. For decades they had been the judges and she the accused. Now, with nothing more than her composure, Claire had overturned the verdict. Around them, guests shifted uncomfortably, caught between pity and awe. Some murmured, "Can you believe it?" while others simply stared, captivated by the spectacle of reversal. The woman they had once dismissed as the unemployed one had risen without raising her voice. The entire room was a witness to the collapse of the hierarchy that had governed her family for years. And Claire did not gloat. That was the most unsettling part of all. She wore serenity like armor, and that calm presence was sharper than any blade of anger. Emily's absence from the room made the silence more profound. Without the bride's shrill protests, the stage belonged entirely to Claire. For the first time in her life, she wasn't forced to compete for the spotlight. The spotlight had found her on its own, and it illuminated not just her, but the smallness of those who had tried to diminish her. Even the waitstaff, usually invisible at these events, had paused at the edges of the room, sensing that something rare was unfolding, something raw and undeniable. When Claire finally spoke, her voice was steady, even gentle. "I don't hold grudges," she said, her eyes sweeping the faces of her parents and then the crowd. "But I do remember." That simple sentence cut deeper than any scream could have. It was not vengeance, it was truth offered without embellishment. The guests leaned in, straining to catch every word, knowing they were watching history rewrite itself in real time. Her father swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in the silence. For a man who had always prided himself on being in control, his power had evaporated. The once commanding patriarch looked smaller than she had ever seen him. His shoulders slumped, his hands trembling against his glass. Her mother attempted a faint smile, but it wavered and collapsed under the weight of guilt. Neither could meet her eyes. For Claire, the moment was not about humiliating them. It was about reclaiming herself, taking back everything they had denied her, not with shouting, but with presence. Some guests turned toward each other, their expressions softening into admiration. The narrative had shifted. Claire was no longer the outcast. She was the revelation of the evening, the story they would tell in hushed voices for years, how the overlooked daughter became the undeniable center. And she didn't need to prove anything. Her existence, her success, her quiet dignity did all the proving necessary. She let her smile linger, not as mockery, but as a declaration of liberation. Her heart no longer raced with anger or desperation for their approval. She realized she didn't need it anymore. In that moment, she wasn't the neglected daughter or the shadowed sister. She was simply Claire, self-made, resilient, untouchable. The weight of years lifted from her shoulders, replaced by an extraordinary calm. As her parents sat diminished before her and the room buzzed with whispers, Claire knew she had turned the blade without lifting a finger. Their power had been in their judgment, and now stripped of it, they were left to face themselves. She had nothing left to prove, nothing left to defend. The control was hers, not because she took it by force, but because she had risen above the need for their validation at all. She looked at her glass, lifted it slowly, and let the corners of her lips curl again. The room leaned forward, waiting for her next words, waiting for her to strike. But Claire didn't need to strike. The silence was her weapon, and her poise was the cut that would linger long after the night ended. And as her father's eyes finally met hers, searching for something he couldn't find, Claire whispered to herself, her smile deepening. But this wasn't revenge. It was freedom. The silence that had fallen over the ballroom lingered long after my father's reluctant admission. It was thick, almost suffocating, and everyone seemed unsure of what to do with themselves. Forks hovered above plates, conversations stalled, and all eyes flicked between Emily and me as if waiting for someone to take the next step. That's when Daniel, Emily's once proud fiancé, stood tall at the head table, his expression carved in cold marble, his voice cut through the uneasy quiet sharper than any knife. "Emily," he said, measured but trembling at the edges with restrained fury. "Is it true? Did you steal her idea? Did you lie to me?" The room collectively inhaled. Emily, pale and rattled, glanced desperately around for support, her eyes darting to our parents, then to the few friends who had remained loyal. No one came to her aid. Her lips trembled as she stammered, "Daniel, it's not what it looks like. I was just protecting the family." But the words fell flat, hollow, and unconvincing. Daniel's jaw clenched. He pulled a sleek folder from his briefcase, one he had brought to the wedding under the assumption it might contain contracts for the glowing business future he and Emily had boasted about. Now he waved it like an indictment. "I invested," he declared, raising his voice for all to hear. "I put $500,000 into Emily's venture, an idea she swore was hers, an idea she promised was revolutionary, her ticket to building something meaningful." He looked toward me, then his eyes meeting mine filled with a dawning recognition. "But now I learn it wasn't hers at all. It was yours. And she lied to my face to get my money." Murmurs rippled across the room like waves on a stormy sea. Guests leaned in closer, whispers carrying the words, fraud, betrayal, sham. The bride standing beside her fiancé only moments earlier now seemed smaller, shrinking beneath the crushing weight of truth. Emily tried to reach for Daniel's arm, desperation pouring from her every movement. "Please," she begged, her voice cracking. "Don't do this here. We can talk about it later, privately." But Daniel shook her off with a look so scathing it could have cut steel. "No. You humiliated me in public by lying, so you will face the truth in public as well. This marriage is over." Gasps echoed across the hall. Several older relatives clutched their pearls, others covered their mouths in shock. Emily's knees buckled as if the strength had been pulled from her body, and she collapsed onto the nearest chair, her pristine white gown crumpling like discarded paper. Her tears fell fast, smudging the carefully painted perfection of her face. Guests began to rise from their seats, some awkwardly excusing themselves, others openly enjoying the drama their cell phones already raised to capture the ruin of what was meant to be the perfect day. Daniel wasn't finished. "And one more thing," he added, his voice ringing with righteous anger. "I will be speaking to my attorneys first thing in the morning. This is fraud, Emily. Fraud. You used me, you conned me, and I will not let you walk away without consequences." His words landed like hammer blows, each one stripping away the last remnants of Emily's carefully crafted image. She wailed, then her sobs echoing against the crystal chandeliers, raw and jagged. "Daniel, please!" she screamed, clutching the hem of his suit trousers. "You don't understand. I only did it because I wanted to prove I was worthy, that I could be as successful as Claire." Her confession only tightened the noose around her. Guests shook their heads, disgust written on their faces. "This is pathetic," one woman whispered audibly. Another muttered, "She had it all and threw it away." From my vantage point across the room, I watched quietly, my hands folded neatly in my lap, my expression unreadable. Inside, there was no glee, no triumphant cheer, only a heavy, complicated mixture of sorrow and vindication. I hadn't lifted a finger yet. Everything Emily had built was crumbling, and the world was watching. My mother buried her face in her hands, whispering prayers under her breath, as if divine intervention might somehow stitch together the tatters of her golden daughter's life. My father remained stone-faced, his silence now condemning rather than protective. And Daniel walked out. He didn't storm, he didn't slam. He simply straightened his jacket, looked around the room with a dignity that Emily no longer possessed, and strode out of the ballroom. The doors closed behind him with a finality that left the air heavy and still. Emily collapsed to the floor, her sobs so loud they rattled in my bones. No one rushed to help her. A few sympathetic aunts lingered nearby, unsure if they should intervene, but the crowd was already dispersing, murmuring about canceled honeymoons and lawsuits about scandal and shame. I stood at my table watching my glass of water still full, untouched. For years I had been invisible, the shadow to Emily's blinding light. But now, in her downfall, the spotlight shifted. Not by my design, but by the consequences of her own lies. And as the ballroom emptied, one thing became clear: no one would forget this night. No one would forget her collapse. And most of all, no one would forget the bride abandoned in her gown, ruined by her own greed. And the guests will not forget the bride left standing alone. My mother found me in the corner of the ballroom after the chaos had died down. Emily's cries still carried faintly from the bridal suite where she had been ushered, though not one guest had chosen to follow her. Most had already left, shaking their heads in disbelief, gossip buzzing as they slipped out into the night. The glittering chandeliers above still cast their glow across the half-empty tables, but the air was thick with humiliation and the remnants of scandal. My mother's heels clicked against the polished floor as she approached, her face pale, her lipstick smudged from where she had pressed her lips together too tightly. When she reached me, she gripped my arm as though holding on to a lifeline. "Claire," she whispered, her voice raw, strained with desperation. "You have to do something. Please, you can't let this be the way people remember us. Our family's name, your sister's name, it's all at stake." I turned toward her, meeting her pleading eyes. For so long I had longed for those eyes to hold pride when they looked at me. Instead, they held fear not for me, but for the image she thought was worth saving. My jaw tightened as I listened. "Our name," I repeated quietly. "That's what matters to you now." Her nails dug into my sleeve. "Yes, of course. People are talking. They'll drag us through the mud. Do you understand how humiliating this is? After everything we've worked for, everything we've built, this could ruin us." I pulled my arm gently but firmly from her grasp. "What you built," I said, my voice steady. "You built Emily's pedestal brick by brick, and you pushed me aside to do it. You wanted her to shine no matter the cost, and now you're watching the structure collapse. And you're asking me to hold it up for you." Her face twisted, a flicker of shame passing before she quickly masked it. "You don't understand. You've always been so sensitive. Families have to present themselves a certain way, Claire. We can't look like fools in front of the entire town. People respect us, your father's career, my social standing." "Stop." I interrupted, my tone sharper than I had ever dared to use with her. "Don't dress this up as duty or pride. You're not asking me to save Emily. You're asking me to save your reflection in other people's eyes." She flinched as though I had slapped her, but still she pressed on, her voice cracking. "She's your sister. She's blood. If you don't help her now, she'll never recover. If you don't help us now, we'll never recover." I stared at her, feeling the weight of years pressing down on me, years of being overlooked, dismissed, belittled. The little girl who had once begged for approval wanted to scream, but the woman who had built something extraordinary from nothing only felt clarity. My voice was calm, almost gentle, though it cut like ice. "I already saved someone, Mother. I saved myself. That is enough." The silence that followed was deafening. My mother's lips parted as if to argue, but no words came. She looked suddenly smaller, her carefully styled hair falling out of place, her shoulders slumped under the weight of her own desperation. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for allies, but there were none. The guests who remained were watching us quietly, their faces betraying nothing, though I could feel their judgment. For once, it wasn't directed at me. I straightened my chin high, feeling the shift in the air. These people, the ones who had whispered about me for years, were now seeing the truth, not the unemployed sister, Not the forgotten daughter, but the woman who had endured, built, and risen above. A few nodded subtly, their expressions softened, as if silently acknowledging my strength. My mother saw it too. She saw the change in the crowd, the way admiration had shifted, the way power had slipped out of her grasp and settled into mine. Her lips trembled and she whispered one last time, almost inaudible, "Claire, please." I didn't answer her. There was nothing left to say. She had chosen her image over me 1,000 times before, and now the mask she clung to was shattered. I would not glue it back together for her. I walked away slowly, deliberately, leaving her to stand alone beneath the glittering lights her desperation laid bare for all to witness. And as I lifted my glass once more, feeling the cool rim press against my fingers, one truth crystallized within me, unshakable and final. But my reputation was the only one left untouched. The ballroom had mostly emptied by the time I stepped out into the hallway, the air quieter now, though heavy with what had unfolded. The echoes of whispers and judgment still clung to the walls, but the storm itself had passed. I walked toward the coat room, my steps measured when I felt a tug at the hem of my dress. Looking down, I found a pair of wide brown eyes staring up at me, my nephew James, barely 10 years old, dressed in a miniature suit that seemed too big for his thin frame. He looked nothing like the confident adults who had paraded themselves through the evening trying to pretend they weren't part of the disaster. Instead, he looked small, frightened and oddly curious. "Aunt Claire," he whispered, his voice almost conspiratorial, as though afraid his mother might hear him even from behind closed doors. "How did you do it? How did you win?" For a moment I was caught off guard. No one had ever asked me that, not with sincerity, not without judgment, not without suspicion. His question wasn't born of bitterness, but wonder. I crouched down so we were eye level, smoothing the skirt of my dress as I steadied myself. I studied his face, so earnest and untainted by the weight of his family's games. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" I asked softly, though I knew. His small hands fidgeted with the cuff of his jacket sleeve. "Everyone always says Mom is the best at everything. Grandma and Grandpa, they always brag about her. But tonight it was different. Tonight everyone looked at you. You weren't scared. You were strong. How did you do that?" His words pierced me deeper than he could know. Behind them was the echo of my own childhood, sitting at family dinners, listening to endless praise heaped upon Emily, while my achievements were dismissed as hobbies, while my dreams were painted as foolish detours. James was already beginning to see the pattern, the same favoritism creeping into his young world. I felt the sting of recognition, a chill that reminded me of what it meant to grow up invisible. I placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "James." I said, my voice low and steady. Being strong doesn't mean people always notice you. Sometimes it means working hard when no one is looking. It means believing in yourself even when others don't. He tilted his head, processing my words. "So, you just kept going." A faint smile tugged at my lips. "Yes, I kept going. Even when it hurt. Even when it felt unfair. Even when everyone thought I was wasting my time. I kept building, and one day what I built was too big to ignore." His eyes widened, a spark of admiration flickering there. "I want to be like that," he said firmly, though his voice still carried the timbre of a child. "Not like all this." He gestured vaguely toward the ballroom where faint sobs of his mother still leaked from behind the suite's doors. My chest tightened. This boy, innocent, curious, unspoiled by the years of favoritism and manipulation, stood on the edge of the same cycle that had nearly broken me. He could grow up crushed under the weight of expectations, or he could learn to rise above them, to carve his own path before the scars set in. I leaned closer, lowering my voice so only he could hear. "You don't have to be like anyone else, James. Not me, not your mom, not even who your grandparents want you to be. You get to decide who you are, and if you ever need help, you come to me. Promise." His face brightened, and he nodded eagerly. "Promise." I brushed a strand of hair from his forehead and kissed the top of his head. For the first time that night, warmth spread through me, not the sharp satisfaction of revenge, not the hollow vindication of watching Emily's downfall, but a quieter, steadier hope. In his eyes I saw possibility. In his small voice I heard the chance of change. He wrapped his arms around me in a quick hug before pulling back, glancing nervously toward the suite where his mother still wept. "I should go," he whispered. "But thank you, Aunt Claire." He darted down the hallway, his small figure swallowed by the shadows of the hotel corridor. I stood there, frozen, my heart beating with a rhythm that felt new and unfamiliar. For the first time, I realized that my battle wasn't just about me. It wasn't even about Emily anymore. It was about breaking something deeper, something that had poisoned our family for generations. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late. Maybe the cycle could finally be broken. The night air was cool as I stepped into the driver's seat of my rental car, the silence of the nearly deserted parking lot a sharp contrast to the chaos I had just left behind. My hands gripped the wheel, and for a long moment I simply sat there, letting the hum of the engine steady my racing thoughts. The hotel lights glittered in the rearview mirror, a reminder of the battlefield I had just walked away from. With a deep breath, I shifted into gear and pulled onto the open road, the city lights of New York still 3 hours ahead. The highway stretched out before me, empty except for the occasional pair of headlights sweeping past. The rhythmic thrum of the tires on the asphalt was almost hypnotic, inviting memories I hadn't let myself touch in years. Alone in the car with nothing but the soft hum of the radio filling the void, I let them surface. I thought back to the early days of my company, to the one-bedroom apartment that doubled as my office, where I worked on a laptop balanced between stacks of takeout boxes. I remembered the nights I cried into my pillow, convinced I had made a mistake leaving behind the steady paycheck of a corporate job. My friends were getting married, buying homes, posting smiling photos of children and vacations, while I sat surrounded by code and rejection emails. I remembered the landlord who threatened eviction when I was late on rent, and the investors who smiled to my face only to dismiss me with a polite shake of the head. Not enough experience. Too risky. Maybe if you had a partner. Their words had burned into me, feeding the same narrative my family had always told I wasn't enough. But I kept going. I stayed up through endless nights teaching myself what I didn't know, burning through failures until small successes began to appear. The first client who said yes. The first check that cleared. The moment I realized I had built something that couldn't be dismissed as a hobby or a phase. And yet the price had been high. Friendships faded when I had no time for dinners or birthdays. Relationships crumbled when partners grew tired of coming second to my dream. I had chosen solitude, and though it brought me triumph, it also carved hollow places in my life. Tonight, watching Emily unravel, I felt that strange duality more than ever. Victory sharp and undeniable, and loss deep and unshakable. My family had finally seen me, truly seen me, but not with pride, only with the shock of realizing what they had thrown away. It was not the validation I had once longed for. It was something colder, something emptier. The road stretched on dark and quiet, broken only by the sweep of headlights in the opposite lane. I let the monotony steady me, my hands loose on the wheel, my eyes focused on the distant glow of the city. Each mile pulled me further from the wreckage of the wedding and deeper into the echo of my own thoughts. What had I really gained tonight? Yes, I had exposed Emily. Yes, I had shown the truth. But in doing so, I had also torn apart what little threads held our family together. There was no going back. I wondered what my grandfather would have thought, the one who had once told me I had vision when no one else believed. Would he have been proud of this moment? Or would he have mourned the family fractured beyond repair? My chest tightened at the thought, and for a moment I had to blink hard to keep the tears from spilling. The road blurred before me until I forced myself to refocus. The car's clock ticked forward, the hours slipping by as the city crept closer. At one point, I pulled off at a rest stop, stepping out into the cold air, stretching my legs and staring up at the starless sky. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and a vending machine buzzed nearby. I bought a bottle of water and sat on a bench, the plastic cool in my hand. I thought again of James, his small voice asking how I had done it. His eyes filled with hope. Perhaps that was the truest victory of the night. Not the headlines, not the wealth, not even the shattering of Emily's facade, but the spark of possibility in the next generation. Maybe I couldn't change the past, but I could change what came after. I climbed back into the car and continued the drive, the skyline of New York eventually rising on the horizon like a promise. The lights glittered, a reminder of what I had built, and the life that awaited me, one separate from the weight of my family's expectations. Still, a heaviness lingered in my chest. Tonight had ended one chapter, but I knew instinctively that the story wasn't finished. There were still shadows lurking, still consequences waiting to unfold. And as the city loomed closer, its brilliance reflecting on the windshield, I felt it settle over me like a quiet warning. But the twists of that night were not yet finished. The city skyline glittered outside my apartment window, but I barely noticed it as I dropped my keys on the counter and sank into the couch. The long drive had left me exhausted, yet my mind refused to quiet. The silence of my loft was almost deafening after the cacophony of the wedding. I leaned back, exhaling slowly, finally allowing myself the smallest moment of peace. That peace lasted less than 5 minutes. My phone lit up on the table, vibrating with a number I hadn't saved but recognized immediately. Emily. For a moment I considered letting it ring out. I could already imagine her voice, sharp, venomous, clinging to whatever shred of control she thought she still had. But something in me, the same instinct that had carried me through every negotiation and every betrayal, told me to answer. I swiped the screen and pressed the phone to my ear. Claire, her voice cracked, stripped of the practiced sweetness she wore like a mask. It was raw, panicked, the voice of someone who had finally run out of options. "Please, you have to help me." I said nothing at first, only letting the silence stretch. It was remarkable how silence unnerved people more than any words could. She filled it, stumbling over her sentences. I don't have anyone else to call. They're all gone. Michael left, the investors are threatening to sue, and Mom and Dad. They won't even look at me. Please, you have the money. I just need something to get back on my feet. Her desperation dripped through the line, but I heard the sharp edge beneath it too. Desperation could easily turn to malice. I let my voice remain steady, calm, calculated. Emily, why me? After everything, why would you think I'd give you money? She hesitated, and then her tone shifted, breaking like glass under pressure. Because if you don't, I'll have nothing left to lose. I already hired someone. A hacker. He's been digging. He's ready to leak things about your company, Claire. Things that will ruin your reputation. Unless you help me. I almost smiled, though it was a bitter, cold smile. This was the Emily I had always known, the sister who cloaked cruelty and desperation, who turned threats into pleas. But what she didn't know was that I had been expecting this. I had learned long ago that the more cornered she became, the more dangerous she would act. Anticipating her move wasn't paranoia. It was survival. Weeks ago, before I ever stepped onto that plane to return home, I had spoken with a cybersecurity specialist, a quiet, brilliant woman who knew how to track digital footprints. I'd told her to keep a close eye on any unusual activity surrounding my company to prepare for the inevitable storm. And she had delivered. Not only did I know about Emily's hacker, but I also knew that his attempts had been traced back directly to her. All I needed now was proof that she admitted it herself. So I softened my tone, feigning sympathy. Emily, what are you saying, that you paid someone to make up lies about me? Her breath hitched. Not lies, just things that make people doubt. You don't understand, Claire. It's the only way I can get back what I deserve. You've always had everything. Her words tumbled over each other, frantic unraveling. I had to do something. I had to fight back. Please just give me the money and I'll make sure he stops. I leaned forward, my hand sliding across the coffee table until my fingers brushed the small device I had set there earlier. I had purchased it in New York for moments exactly like this, a precaution I wasn't sure I'd ever need. But in New York, it was perfectly legal for me to record this conversation without her knowledge. My thumb hovered over the button as she kept talking, her voice rising with panic. "Claire, do you hear me? He's ready. He'll leak it all tomorrow. You'll lose everything you worked for. Don't let that happen. Please, you're my sister. Help me." I closed my eyes briefly, steadying myself. For years I had been on the receiving end of her manipulations, her cruelty, her casual thefts of my work, my relationships, my dignity. Tonight, for the first time, she was revealing herself without the mask, without the shield of parental favoritism, without the glamour of being the golden child. And I had the power to capture it, to finally hold evidence that even she couldn't twist. My hand pressed firmly against the device. I pressed the button. I hit record. And as her voice poured through the line, wild and desperate, confessing every detail of her plot, I knew that she had finally undone herself. I pressed record. Morning broke over the city, pale light seeping in through the wide windows of my loft. I hadn't slept much. The conversation with Emily still echoed in my ears, her frantic voice tripping over confessions she thought would vanish into the air between us. But I had it now. Proof. For once, the truth wasn't mine alone to carry. It was captured, sealed, undeniable. I sat at my kitchen table laptop, opened the small recorder beside it. My finger hovered over the play button, and when I pressed it, her words filled the quiet room. "I already hired someone. A hacker. He's been digging. He's ready to leak things about your company, Claire." Her tone cracked, desperate, unraveling into threats. Not lies, just things that make people doubt. It's the only way I can get back what I deserve. Each sentence was another stone in the wall she had built around her own ruin. The weight of what I held pressed against me. For years I had been silenced, dismissed by my parents, overshadowed by Emily, robbed of my ideas, my pride, my place in the family. Every time I had tried to speak up, she twisted the narrative, painted herself as the victim, and I was cast aside as bitter, jealous, unstable. But not this time. For once, her own voice carried the truth. I emailed the file to my attorney first, attaching a short note. "I believe this is enough to proceed." His response was quick, crisp, and almost incredulous. "It is." "Do you want this public?" I stared at the words on the screen. Did I? To release it meant ending whatever scraps of family remained. To hold it back meant risking her trying again, always circling, always lurking. The decision crystallized in me with a clarity that surprised me. I had lived too long in shadows, too long under her distortions. It was time to let the light in. My hands didn't tremble as I uploaded the file. My attorney had advised a cautious release through official channels, but I knew better. Emily had lived her life in spectacle, basking in attention, manipulating crowds. It was only fitting that her undoing happen in the same spotlight she had always demanded. I posted the recording on a public platform paired with a brief statement. Last night I received this call from my sister. Her words speak for themselves. Within minutes, the clip spread. Notifications poured onto my screen in a relentless flood, journalists requesting comments, investors sending reassurances, strangers expressing outrage. The story caught fire faster than I could refresh. By the time an hour had passed, Emily's name was trending alongside words like fraud, extortion, and hacker plot. I turned on the television, flipping to a news channel. A reporter stood outside the very hotel I had left the night before, speaking with urgent precision. Sources confirm the viral audio clip circulating online is authentic. It features Emily Carter, daughter of prominent upstate family, admitting to hiring a hacker to sabotage her sister's multi-million-dollar company. Legal experts suggest she could face criminal charges for conspiracy and cybercrimes. The camera cut to guests from the wedding, their faces blurred but their words sharp. She always seemed perfect, but I guess we didn't know the half of it. Another voice chimed in. Her sister was the strong one all along. Emily just made sure nobody saw it. I felt no joy watching her reputation collapse. It wasn't triumph I felt, but a heavy, unshakable release, like dropping a burden I'd carried for too long. For the first time, the world was seeing what I had endured. The lies were no longer just mine to counter. They were hers to answer for. By afternoon, the calls from my parents started. First my mother, her voice quivering with panic. "Claire, how could you? She's your sister. Do you want to see her in jail?" Then my father, more subdued but just as hollow. "Think of the family name. This doesn't have to go public any further." I listened silent until their pleas ran out. Then I answered calm and certain. "It's already public, and for once it's the truth. You always wanted me silent. Not anymore." I ended the calls before they could reply. The hours blurred together, the clip dissected across every platform, pundits debating what consequences Emily might face. Screens lit up with her name, each headline another nail in the coffin of her carefully constructed image. Her allies distanced themselves. Her fiancé formally withdrew from their engagement in a press statement, and investors announced they would pursue damages. For so long, Emily had twisted every situation to her advantage, weaving stories that turned villains into victims and victims into fools. But this time, she had no script to hide behind. It was her voice, her confession, her downfall. I closed my laptop at last, the city outside glowing against the night. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to brace for her next move. She was trapped by her own words, and no amount of spin or charm could rewrite them. This time, she couldn't twist the truth. The days after the recording went public were a blur of headlines, phone calls, and silence that felt both liberating and strange. My sister's name was now synonymous with betrayal, and mine had become a symbol of resilience. Yet even as the media storm raged, another storm brewed quietly, one I hadn't seen coming. It arrived not through the news, but through a neatly embossed envelope slipped under my apartment door. The return address was a law office I recognized instantly, a firm from upstate that had represented my grandfather's estate years ago. I stared at the envelope for a long while before opening it. Inside was a short note handwritten from one of the attorneys I had briefly spoken with during the chaos of Emily's wedding. He requested that I attend a meeting in the city that afternoon. The words were formal, but the tone hinted at weight. Something about my grandfather, something about unfinished business. Curiosity warred with unease as I arrived at the office, greeted by an older man with a kind face and sharp eyes. He introduced himself as Mr. Harrington, executor of my grandfather's will. We sat in a mahogany-paneled conference room, its quiet dignity pressing against me like a cathedral. He folded his hands on the table before speaking. "Claire," he began, his voice measured, "I suspect you are unaware of the full provisions of your grandfather's estate. Certain documents were overlooked, perhaps deliberately, when your parents assumed control." He slid a folder across the table, the thick paper heavy with years. "Your grandfather left behind a company, small, almost forgotten now, but it was built on a patent one he developed with your input during your college years." My heart stuttered. Memories surged, late nights in my grandfather's garage, sketching out ideas for a software tool I'd been experimenting with his encouragement when no one else believed. "You've got vision, Claire," he had told me then. "More than most of us ever will." The attorney continued, his words deliberate. "The company, modest as it was left in your name. However, your parents, citing your youth and inexperience, entrusted its operations to your sister. On paper, she was its manager. But legally, ownership has always been yours." The room seemed to tilt. "Mine?" I whispered. "All this time," he nodded. "Yes. And though the company itself has languished neglected under your sister's direction, the intellectual property within it remains valuable. It is yours to reclaim should you choose." I sat back, the weight of it pressing into me. So much made sense now. The veiled comments my father had made years ago about me not understanding the family's responsibilities. The strange way Emily had spoken of managing legacy work, she clearly didn't grasp. They had hidden it from me, perhaps fearing that acknowledgement would only stoke the fire they always tried to smother. Tears pricked my eyes before I could stop them. It wasn't just about a company. It was about my grandfather's faith in me, faith that had been stolen and twisted. They had erased me from my own inheritance, just as they had tried to erase me from the family story altogether. Mr. Harrington leaned forward gently. "You have two options, Claire. You may let it fall into bankruptcy. It would frankly not take much, or you may step in, take control, and decide its future. It will be difficult work, but it is legally and rightfully yours." I pressed my palms together, staring at the folder as though it might vanish if I blinked. My grandfather had believed in me when no one else had. This company, however small, was the proof. And my parents had kept it from me, feeding it to Emily as though she had earned it, as though she could ever understand the work behind it. The choice should have been simple: let it burn, let it collapse with her. But the thought of abandoning what my grandfather had built with me felt like a betrayal of him, of myself, of every night I had once believed in that vision. "I'll take it," I said, my voice steady though my hands trembled. "I'll reclaim it." The attorney smiled faintly, nodding as though he had hoped I would say so. He slid a stack of papers toward me, documents to sign, formalities to begin the transfer. As I scrawled my name, the tears finally slipped down my cheeks, silent and unrelenting. They weren't tears of weakness, but of vindication, of sorrow, of something long overdue finally being restored. I closed the folder at last, my breath unsteady but certain. My grandfather's faith had not been wasted. They had tried to bury it, to bury me, but the truth had clawed its way back to the surface. The truth was mine again. The final truth belonged to me. The folder containing my grandfather's company still sat on the corner of my desk days later, a silent reminder of the past and the burden of unfinished legacies. But as I looked at it, I began to realize that I didn't want my life defined solely by battles with my family or by the wreckage of Emily's envy. Victory was one thing, transformation was another, and transformation was what I craved now. The press wouldn't stop calling. They wanted interviews, glossy magazine spreads, sound bites about the sister who had been humiliated only to rise again. I chose carefully what I shared, never indulging in gossip about Emily, never letting bitterness creep into my words. Instead, I spoke about innovation, about resilience, about what it meant to be a woman carving out space in an industry still dominated by men. Audiences leaned in. Headlines followed. For the first time, my story wasn't filtered through someone else's lens. Yet one night, after another long day of answering questions, I found myself staring at an old photograph tucked between the papers from my grandfather's estate. It showed me at 19, hair pulled back in a messy bun, scribbling code in his workshop, my grandfather looking over my shoulder with quiet pride. My chest ached as I realized that the best way to honor him wasn't simply to reclaim what had been stolen. It was to build something enduring that others could stand on. That was the night the idea came to me, a foundation, a scholarship program for young women in technology. Not just tuition checks, but mentorship workshops and internships that would help them break through the same barriers I had once fought against. The thought of it lit something inside me, brighter than revenge, stronger than recognition. This was how I would take the ashes of the past and turn them into fuel for the future. Within weeks, I launched the Claire Donovan Foundation for Women in Technology. The announcement rippled across the media. Outlets that once speculated about family drama now ran headlines about philanthropy and empowerment. Journalists who had previously asked about wedding scandals now asked about the foundation's goals. The narrative was shifting, and this time I was steering it. Applications flooded in from across the country, young women from small towns who had been told computers weren't for them, daughters of immigrants who dreamed of Silicon Valley but couldn't imagine affording it, single mothers determined to finish their degrees. Reading their stories, I saw fragments of myself in every one of them: the doubt, the hunger, the vision. The first group of recipients gathered in New York for a small reception. Standing before them, I felt a lump in my throat. These weren't just scholarship winners, they were proof that the cycle could be broken. As I handed out certificates, I told them, "What you build will outlast anyone's doubt. Don't let anyone steal your story as they once tried to steal mine." The room erupted in applause, but it wasn't for me. It was for the possibility of something greater. Reporters covered the event, splashing photographs of me surrounded by eager young women, calling me a trailblazer, a role model, a force of change. For the first time, I read those words without flinching, because they felt true. The foundation wasn't about proving my family wrong anymore. It was about proving to myself that I could build beyond the shadows of betrayal. Still, I couldn't ignore the irony. The truest act of revenge wasn't Emily's public humiliation or my father's confession, it was this: creating a legacy no one could erase. A legacy Emily could never touch. My triumph wasn't in their downfall, but in rising so high that their attempts to diminish me looked small in comparison. When a prominent magazine featured me on its cover under the headline, "The Woman Who Rewrote Her Story," I smiled for the camera, knowing the truth. This was more than rewriting. It was reclaiming. It was setting fire to the old script and crafting a new one with my own hands. Each step of the way, I felt my grandfather's presence. The foundation's offices displayed one of his old quotes engraved on the wall: "Vision is nothing without courage." Every young woman who walked through those doors would see it, and maybe one day they would carry it forward too. Late one evening, as I walked through the quiet of the office after the last scholarship recipient had left, I paused by the window overlooking the city. The skyline glittered like a promise, a reflection of everything I had fought for. For years, I had been defined by what was taken from me. Now I was defined by what I chose to give, and I knew with unshakable certainty that this was the victory that mattered most. Not the whispers silenced at a wedding, not the fall of a sister desperate to outshine me. The true revenge was legacy, and legacy was mine. This time the story wasn't stolen. This time it was mine fully and irrevocably. And this time the story would not be taken away. News of the foundation's launch was still echoing in headlines when I first heard about Emily's departure. It came quietly through whispers from relatives who didn't know I was within earshot. "She's gone." One aunt murmured, her voice hushed, as if speaking too loudly might conjure Emily back. Packed her things and left town in the middle of the night. There was no fanfare, no dramatic goodbye, just silence where once there had been endless noise and demands for attention. A few weeks later, a former neighbor sent me a clipped article from a small-town paper. It showed Emily in a plain polo shirt standing behind the counter of a roadside diner 2 states away. The headline read, simply, "New waitstaff joins local eatery." No mention of her once glittering social ambitions, no trace of the elaborate plans for society weddings and country club memberships. Just a woman reduced to anonymity, stripped of the throne she had built on lies. I stared at the grainy photograph longer than I expected, searching for something in her eyes. Was it anger? Shame, regret? I couldn't tell. The sister who once mocked me as the unemployed one now served coffee for minimum wage, and the irony was sharp enough to sting. Family members clucked their tongues, muttering that she had brought it on herself, but I didn't feel triumphant. What settled in my chest instead was a heavy emptiness. People had expected me to celebrate her downfall. They thought I would take satisfaction in watching her life unravel, that I would laugh at the symmetry of it all. But there was no laughter in me, only the hollow echo of what betrayal costs, not just to the betrayed, but to the betrayer too. Emily had gambled everything on her greed and envy, and in losing, she had dismantled her own world. What remained was not justice served on a golden platter, but a quiet ruin as bitter as it was inevitable. I caught myself remembering small things. Her hand tugging mine when we were children, the way she used to sneak cookies into my pocket when she thought no one was looking, the sound of her laughter before jealousy poisoned it. Those fragments made her humanity harder to deny, even as the weight of her cruelty loomed larger in my memory. I wondered if she ever thought of those moments too, or if bitterness had swallowed them whole. At night, when the noise of reporters and meetings faded, I sometimes pictured Emily in that diner uniform, carrying trays to strangers who had no idea who she once pretended to be. The image didn't bring me joy. It brought a question I wasn't ready to answer. Had I truly won if the price was a sister broken beyond repair? Or was this the only ending she could have written for herself? The bitterness of it lingered like unshed tears. Justice had been done, but justice is not the same as peace. And in the quiet of my thoughts, I realized that peace could only come from one thing, a choice that was still mine to make. But could I make it? Could I truly forgive her? The question lodged in my heart like a stone, heavy and immovable. And as I sat in the silence, the thought came unbidden. But can I forgive them? The news of Emily's quiet disappearance lingered in the air like an unresolved chord, and I carried its weight with me when I agreed to meet my parents for dinner. They chose a quiet restaurant in town, a place dimly lit with candles and soft music, as though ambiance might soften the conversation we all knew was coming. I arrived early, my nerves steady, but my mind sharp, unwilling to let nostalgia disarm me. When they walked in, their faces told the story before their words ever could, creased with guilt, worn with shame, and softened with an unfamiliar humility. We ordered mechanically menus serving as shields until the silence became unbearable. My father was the first to speak, his voice low and strained. "Claire," he said, "we owe you more than we can ever repay. We failed you, time and again." My mother, usually so composed, dabbed at her eyes with a napkin before adding, "We were wrong, blind, foolish. We made Emily everything, and in doing so, we made you nothing. That was our sin." Their words were heavy, almost desperate, as though they feared I might walk out before they finished. I listened without interruption, my fork resting untouched on the table. I had imagined this moment countless times, their apologies rehearsed in the theater of my mind, but reality felt more complicated. Hearing them admit the truth did not undo the years of being dismissed, ignored, and sacrificed for the sake of Emily's shine. Their regret was genuine, yes, but it came too late to erase the scars. When my turn came, I kept my voice even, my gaze steady. "You put me aside to elevate her. You asked me to shrink so she could grow, and you never once stopped to ask what that cost me." My father dropped his head into his hands while my mother reached across the table, her trembling fingers barely brushing mine. "We can't undo the past," she whispered. "But please, let us try to be better now." It would have been easy to reject them outright to savor the control that had so long been denied to me. Yet, as I studied them, two aging parents humbled by their mistakes, I realized I did not crave vengeance against them. What I craved was respect, finally, unequivocally. So I set my terms. If you want me in your lives, it will be on my conditions. No more dismissing, no more favoritism, no more rewriting history to suit your guilt. You treat me as I am your daughter, your equal, or you lose me entirely. My words were sharp but measured, the kind of truth that could not be softened by candlelight. They nodded, not daring to protest, their remorse filling the space where arguments once lived. Dinner ended quietly, plates half-eaten, hearts heavy, but strangely lighter too. For the first time, the balance of power had shifted. I was no longer the forgotten daughter at the edge of the table. I was the one setting the terms, defining the future. As I walked out into the night, cool air brushing my face, I knew this was not reconciliation. It was the beginning of something harder, but truer. And with every step, the thought echoed in me, resolute and unyielding, I set my condition. A year passed, carrying with it the echoes of broken vows, bitter reckonings, and quiet victories. Time had reshaped the rawness of those nights into something sharper, something purposeful. When I stepped onto the stage at the technology conference in New York, the lights washed over me and I no longer carried the weight of being overlooked. The auditorium brimmed with faces, industry leaders, journalists, young women eager to glimpse what resilience looked like. And in the front row sat my nephew, his eyes wide with pride. His presence the most important validation I could ever receive. I spoke not of revenge, but of rebirth. I shared the announcement I had held close until that day I had purchased the small family company my grandfather once built, the same one my parents had handed to Emily. I had taken it back not to wield it as a weapon, but to honor the man who once told me I had vision. I transformed it into a center where young people, especially girls, could learn coding, engineering, and entrepreneurship free of cost. Talent should never be silenced, I told the room, and dreams should never be dismissed as foolish. The applause thundered, rolling over me in waves that cleansed the last remnants of doubt. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw her. Emily had slipped into the back of the auditorium, her once effortless elegance replaced by an anonymity that clung to her like a shadow. She didn't approach, didn't speak, didn't try to reclaim her part in the narrative. She only watched her expression unreadable before turning and slipping quietly out the door. It was not confrontation, it was concession, her silent acknowledgement of defeat. I looked down at my nephew, who leaned forward eagerly, his small hands clapping with all the force he could muster. In that moment, I knew the cycle had broken. He would grow up in a world where ambition wasn't mocked, where his heroes weren't chosen for him, but built by themselves. The cameras flashed, the audience rose, and for the first time, the story being written about me wasn't stolen or rewritten. It was mine. I stood there, letting the sound of celebration wash over me, my heart steady, my purpose clear. As I glanced around the room filled with possibility, one thought crystallized in my mind, carrying both finality and promise. This was not an ending at all. Looking around the room, I knew this was only the beginning. And that brings us to the end of Claire's journey, a story of pain turned into power, of being silenced, only to rise stronger than ever. Her family's betrayal became the fuel for her triumph, and what was meant to humiliate her became the moment she reclaimed her voice. But what about you? Have you ever been underestimated, dismissed, or pushed aside only to find strength in proving everyone wrong? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your experiences and reactions in the comments below. Do you think Claire was right to set her own conditions for her family, or should she have chosen a different path? And what would you have done in her place? If this story kept you hooked, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next tale filled with drama, betrayal, and redemption. Your voice matters here, and your perspective could be the spark for our next conversation.